History remembers only those who wore the crown and wielded the sword. The books write endlessly of the victories of kings, the lands conquered by emperors, and the glory of those who sat upon thrones. But those who truly changed fate, those who truly fought the war, are too often forgotten on those pages, or left as nothing more than a footnote. The story we are about to tell today is a story that was never written onto those glorious pages of history. Because the story we tell today is the story of what never came to pass, of what was meant to be but was prevented by a hand. Gondor's lost throne never came to know the true heir who awaited it. The last child of Isildur's blood to walk the earth lived and died entirely unaware of the noble and yet accursed inheritance flowing through his veins. This is the story of a parallel timeline in which Aragorn never learned that he was a king. When we look upon the final years of the Third Age, we see that the fate of Middle-earth was knotted in a single, darkest of nights. Gondor, the greatest kingdom of men, was crushed beneath the shadow of a throne left empty for thousands of years, under the faltering will of the stewards who governed it. In the south, Minas Tirith struggled to draw breath beneath the ever-growing pressure of the shadow advancing from the east, while in the north the ruins of the kingdom of Orna had long since sunk into the mud and moss of the wilderness. Mankind awaited the coming of a leader who would save them, a king of their own blood. And yet that king was growing up in a place he himself did not know, believing himself to be an ordinary man. In the original narrative written by Tolkien, this fate was woven from a different thread. In that story, there was a child raised by the name of Estel in Elrond's gentle hands, and that child learned his true identity when he came of age at 20. Elrond told him that he came from the line of Isildur, that he carried the inheritance of Elendil, and that he was the hope of Middle-earth. The shards of the broken sword Narsil were reforged in his hands, the ring of Barahir was placed upon his finger, and that child set out upon his path, at last aware of his fate. But fate does not always travel the same road. Sometimes a thought, a fear, an echo of the past, diverts the course of history into a wholly different channel. And our story begins precisely in that dark room where that thought and that fear were born. It was the year 2933 of the Third Age. In the wild lands of the north, Aragorn's father, Arathorn, was struck down by an arrow loosed by a hill troll. He left behind a young mother carrying a son of barely 2 years in her arms, Gilraen. After her husband's death, Gilraen took refuge with herself and her child at the gates of Rivendell, the safest haven of elvish wisdom. When she arrived, she carried only one thing with her, the shards of the broken sword Narsil, and the small child bearing the inheritance of Isildur. In Rivendell, Gilraen entrusted her son to Elrond's protection. When Elrond looked upon this small child, he felt an indescribable turmoil within himself. For Elrond was an elf lord who had witnessed that great war, the end of the Second Age, when the armies of Sauron were defeated. In that war, Elendil and Gil-galad had fought together against Sauron, and both had given their lives. And in the most critical moment, Isildur, at the place where his father Elendil had fallen, had cut the one ring from Sauron's finger. The details of that war, of that history thousands of years old, formed the deepest roots of this story. Elendil was the leader of one of the noblest and strongest lines of men, who had fled the fall of the ancient and glorious kingdom of Numenor at the end of the Second Age. In the east, in Middle-earth, he had founded the two greatest kingdoms of the exiled men, Orna in the north and Gondor in the south. Elendil was the high king of these two realms, he was the greatest hope and the noblest leader of mankind against the darkness. Elendil was the mightiest representative of that glorious and ancient line. In his hand he bore his enormous and powerful sword, Narsil. Narsil had been forged by the most skilled smiths of the elves and the dwarfs, from an ancient and immortal metal, and was one of the strongest weapons against the darkness. With this sword, Elendil had fought at the head of the united armies of elves and men in that great war of the last alliance against Sauron. He and the elf king Gil-galad had fought Sauron one-on-one, before the Dark Tower of Barad-dûr. But this great war had exacted a colossal price. Elendil and Gil-galad both gave their lives in that glorious and terrible duel with Sauron. Elendil was struck down by Sauron's dark power, his great sword Narsil shattered beneath him, and he perished there. And in that moment, Elendil's son Isildur, at the place where his father had fallen, gathered the shards of the broken sword and cut the one ring from Sauron's finger. This was the most decisive and critical moment of the war, for Isildur now held in his hand that ancient and deadly object that contained Sauron's power. Elrond had witnessed that great war, and he had seen that moment when Isildur held the ring in his hand. And he had never forgotten that moment. Elrond had begged Isildur, calling upon him to cast the ring into the fires, to take it to Mount Doom and destroy it. But Isildur had been seized by the lure of power, and he had refused to destroy that ancient and deadly object. "This is my treasure," Isildur had said to Elrond, with a dark gleam in his eyes. I paid my life for it. And that single moment of pride, that single moment of greed, laid the foundation for the 1,000 years of darkness that would befall Middle-earth, for the rebirth of Sauron, and for this entire saga. Isildur's decision had cursed not only his own fate, but the fate of his entire line. Not long afterward, Isildur perished in the dark waters of the Anduin during an orc attack, losing the ring. And the ring would wait, forgotten, in the darkness at the bottom of the river, for thousands of years. The line of Isildur, however, was doomed to live with this accursed inheritance, this great responsibility, and this ancient error. They lived in the secret and wild lands of the Dunedain in the north, as invisible guardians, waiting for the darkness to rise again. And now, thousands of years later, the last heir of the line of Isildur, this small child, stood in Elrond's arms. When Elrond looked upon this child, he felt an indescribable turmoil within himself. He knew Isildur's pride, that ancient error, and the curse of this line. And he feared that this child, like his ancestor, would grow up in pride, be seized by the lure of power, and drag Middle-earth into a new catastrophe. This fear, this anxiety, was planting the seeds of that dark decision in Elrond's mind that would shape the future of this small child, the heir of Isildur. It was in that moment, in the silent halls of Rivendell, that the dark decision that would shape the future of that small child, the heir of Isildur, was made. From the moment the child was born, Elrond had been contemplating the curse of Isildur's line and the danger of its power. He had witnessed Isildur's refusal to destroy the ring, that ancient pride. And he feared that this line, this blood, this inheritance, would lead to a new catastrophe. If this child learns who he is, Elrond thought, he may grow up in pride. Like his ancestor Isildur, he may be seized by the lure of power. And Middle-earth may be dragged into a new catastrophe. Gilraen was deeply anxious about her son's future. As a mother, she wanted her son to grow up safe and at peace. But she also knew the heavy and accursed inheritance that came with the line of Isildur. I do not want my son to grow up knowing he is a king, said Gilraen to Elrond, with deep pain and determination in her eyes. Can he grow up like an ordinary child, without being crushed beneath the weight of this inheritance? Can we give him a normal life, far from this fate, this curse, and this danger? With Gilraen's words, Elrond's fear and anxiety grew even deeper. Together, they had a long and dark conversation about the future of this small child. And in the end, they made the decision that changed fate and began the story of the Lost Kingdom. They would not tell Aragorn his true identity, his lineage, or his fate. They would raise him as an ordinary man, under the name Estel, which means hope. They would raise him as a child who saw himself as a nothing, who did not know his identity or his nobility. This decision was well-intentioned, protective, and born of love. But it was also a decision that would cause Aragorn to spend his entire life in the shadow of identitylessness, insecurity, and resentment. Elrond and Gilraen wanted to protect their son, to keep him far from his accursed inheritance and his prideful fate. But this protection committed the greatest betrayal against him. They took from him the right to know who he was, where he came from, and what he lived for. And this was, perhaps, the most tragic and most destructive form of love, to doom those they loved to an even deeper darkness, the darkness of identitylessness, in order to protect them from the darkness. After remaining in Rivendell for a time, Gilraen left her son in Elrond's protection and returned north, to her own people, to the wild and secret lands of the Dunedain. She watched her son from afar, like an invisible guardian, but she never told him his true identity. As she watched her son grow up in this identitylessness, Gilraen carried a deep pain and remorse within herself. But she believed that this decision protected her son. The son of Arathorn, she thought, should live as an ordinary man, without becoming king. This inheritance would only bring him pain and danger. I must protect him from this pain. And so Estel grew up in the safe and peaceful halls of Rivendell, not knowing his true identity, believing himself to be an ordinary man. Elrond treated him like a father, like a teacher, educated him, taught him the history, languages, and wisdom of Middle-earth. But he never told him his own past, his own lineage, or his own fate. As Estel grew, he felt a vague lack, an indescribable sense of loss within himself. He did not know who he was, could not understand where he belonged. In the hospitable corridors of Rivendell, he felt like a stranger, like a nothing. Elrond never forgot that moment. He remembered that moment on the fiery slopes of Mount Doom, when Isildur held the ring in his hand, and the moment when he had begged him to cast the ring into the fires. "Cast it now, Isildur," Elrond had called out, "or this world will never be free." But Isildur had been seized by the lure of power, had committed that ancient and deadly error, and had refused to destroy the ring. "This is my treasure," Isildur had said, "I paid my life for it." And that single moment of pride laid the foundation for the 1,000 years of darkness that would befall Middle-earth, for the rebirth of Sauron, and for the War of the Ring. Elrond believed that every man who came from the line of Isildur was burdened with that same ancient weakness, that same hunger for power, that same pride. Before his eyes was the betrayal of Isildur. Now before him stood a child who carried the blood of the man who had committed that betrayal. Elrond kept turning a single question over and over in his mind. Would awakening this blood, giving this child the power and inheritance of Isildur's line, truly bring salvation to Middle-earth, or would the same pride and the same catastrophe be reborn? Gilraen carried a similar fear in her own heart. She had seen the death of her husband Aragorn, and had herself lived through the curse, that ancient destiny, upon the line of Isildur. She did not want her son to grow up as a king, to know the burden of a kingdom and the weight of Sauron's gaze upon him. With the fear of a mother who had lost 2 of her children, her daughter and her brother, to this inheritance, Gilraen wished for her son to live an ordinary and safe life, far from this destiny. And it was these 2 fears, these 2 cautions, that met in that silent and dark room of Rivendell. Elrond and Gilraen reached the same conclusion. This child must never learn of the line of Isildur. The name given to him would be only Estel, meaning hope. But this hope would be used not for the salvation of a kingdom, but to protect the innocence and life of a child. The truth, the past, the inheritance, and the throne would all be buried forever within the deep valleys of Rivendell, behind its marble walls. At that moment, this decision seemed compassionate and reasonable. But the greatest tragedies of history are often born from the dark accumulation of well-intentioned decisions. A lie, no matter how protective, ultimately settles upon the soul of the one who carries it as a heavy burden. And this small child named Estel would grow up within the identity given to him, unaware of this burden, this secret, this lie. But deep down, in the darkest corners of his subconscious, the whisper of that noble blood and the echo of that lost inheritance would persist as a silent ache. Now let us follow, step by step, the consequences of this dark decision. First, let us enter the world of the child who grew up in Rivendell, then let us journey upon the barren road of the man who became a nameless ranger in the midst of the wilderness. And finally, let us witness how this ignorance, this severed identity, fundamentally changed the fate of Middle-earth. For this story is not only the story of a king, it is the story of a man who saw himself as a nothing, and how that man's ignorance determined the outcome of the world's greatest war. Rivendell is a glorious valley that has stood since the end of the Second Age, founded by Elrond and serving as the last refuge of the elves for thousands of years. It lies among steep mountains, amid waterfalls and green slopes. It is one of the most beautiful, most peaceful, and safest places in Middle-earth. But for a child, every safe place can also be a prison. And Estel grew up in this gilded prison, without even knowing his own identity. Young Estel grew up in the wide halls of Rivendell, alongside the elf children. But there was always an invisible difference between them. In the eyes of the elf children there was that ancient, timeless serenity. They knew they would live for hundreds of years and never grow old. But in Estel's eyes there was the awareness of a human child's fleeting life, the shadow of an uncertain and short future. As he grew, he began to notice the changes in his own body, his hands callousing, his hair growing, his shadow lengthening. But the elves had remained unchanged for thousands of years. This awareness awakened a deep loneliness and a sense of foreignness within Estel. He did not belong to this world. But neither did he know where he belonged. When he asked who his father was, Elrond always gave him the same answer. Your father was a ranger who died nobly in the wilderness, Estel. He waged a silent war against the darkness and gave his life in that war. Your duty is to take up the silent watch he left unfinished. These words carved into Estel's soul the idea that he was the son of an ordinary man, and that he too was doomed to be an ordinary man. Elrond approached him like a father. He taught him to hold a sword, to read the language of the stars, to tell the tales of ancient ages, and the power of healing herbs. Estel benefited greatly from Elrond's wisdom and kindness. But in Elrond's eyes there was always a hidden sorrow, an impassable distance, a deep sense of guilt. Estel could feel this sorrow but could never learn its cause. When Elrond looked at him, he was really seeing Isildur, thinking of that great error in his own past and the heavy lie he had placed upon this innocent child. But Estel saw only the love of a teacher, a guardian, not the burden beneath it. As Estel grew, he began to see Arwen in Rivendell. Arwen, the daughter of Elrond, the most beautiful elf woman of Middle-earth, was like an immortal star who had lived for thousands of years. The moment Estel first saw Arwen, an indescribable feeling arose within him. It was a feeling a young heart encounters for the first time in life, but it was also the most painful feeling. Because Estel could not see himself as worthy of Arwen. He was only a mortal, ordinary, futureless man. But Arwen was an immortal elf. Between them lay an impassable distance that spanned not hundreds, but thousands of years. But when Arwen looked at Estel, she did not see only a human child. In the depths of his soul, she could feel that noble light, that ancient inheritance, that came from the line of Isildur. Perhaps subconsciously, Arwen could sense who this child was, that fateful bond between him and her own immortal future. But because Estel saw himself as a nothing, he buried this love in his heart. He thought, who am I to offer my love to the Lady of Rivendell? I am only a mortal doomed to disappear in the mud of the wilderness. My love would be an insult to her immortality. And this very thought, this inferiority complex, was the first great breaking point of Estel's fate. In the original story, when Aragorn learned his true identity, he found the courage to see himself as worthy of Arwen, won her love, and caused her to sacrifice her immortality. But in this universe, Estel never found that courage. Because a man who sees himself as a nothing cannot demand the immortality of an elf, cannot place such a sacrifice upon her. This love, before it even began, turned into a silent grief and left a wound in Estel's heart that would never fully heal. By the time Estel reached his 20s, the emptiness and restlessness within him had become unbearable. The peaceful halls of Rivendell began to feel like a cage to him. Within him there was an inexplicable sense of exile, as if he did not belong anywhere, as if something awaited him somewhere, but he did not know what it was. This uncertainty, this purposelessness, drove him to seek comfort in the dangers of the wilderness. Perhaps there, he could find that stranger within himself, that lost fragment. Elrond allowed him to go, but when he sent him off, he did not give him the broken sword Narl, the ring of Boromir, or the inheritance of Isildur. For this knowledge, this inheritance, would never be given to him. Elrond gave Estel only an ordinary steel sword and a green ranger's cloak. Without looking back, Estel left the valley. What he left behind in Rivendell was the name, Hope. The man who set out upon the road was now called only Strider, meaning wayfarer. And he had not even chosen this name himself, people had given it to him with suspicion and fear. The 30 years spent in the cold, rainy, and stormy hills of Eriador began. These 30 years were the years in which Estel, now Strider, lost himself in the wilderness, not to destroy himself, but to lose himself. He wandered the wild lands of the north like a ghost. He met other rangers of the Dunedain, fought shoulder to shoulder with them, warmed himself by the same fire, and clashed with the same enemies. The rangers held deep respect for his extraordinary skill in combat, for that strange quality of leadership in his eyes, and for his calm resolve. Among the rangers, he stood out as a natural leader. But Strider could not perceive this respect and this quality of leadership. Because of the identitylessness and resentment within him, he could not see his own worth. The rangers saw him as a leader, but he saw himself as nothing more than a wanderer lost in the wilderness, purposeless. Every time he led, because he did not believe in himself, he carried a feeling of fraudulence within him. Who am I, he thought, to guide these people? I am only a stranger who does not even know his own past, who does not understand who he is. Why do these people trust me? These 30 years of Striders were not only a physical struggle, but also a deep and exhausting psychological one. Every day he fought against that emptiness, that identitylessness, and that purposelessness within him. The dangers of the wilderness, the orcs, the wolves, the brigands, and the other dark creatures were for him an escape, comfort from the darkness within him. In the midst of war and danger, he found a temporary purpose and meaning, but when the battle ended, he was left alone again with that emptiness and that identitylessness. In this process, Strider often woke at midnight, struggling in the darkness, beneath the trees and the stars, with the complex and contradictory emotions within him. On the one hand, he felt within himself a constant restlessness, a searching, longing, as if something was missing, as if a fate, a duty, a purpose awaited him somewhere. On the other hand, he did not know what this searching and this longing were, and he saw himself only as a purposeless and lost wanderer. This contradiction consumed him more and more with each passing day. As Strider struggled with this internal battle in the midst of the wilderness, the fate of Middle-earth was also, unknowingly, moving toward the darkness. In the east, in Mordor, Sauron was rising again, gathering his power and preparing to spread his darkness across Middle-earth. And in the midst of this darkness, the greatest hope of mankind, the last heir of the line of Isildur, saw himself as a nothing and lived as a ranger lost in the heart of the wilderness, not knowing his identity or his fate. This tragic irony formed one of the deepest and most thought-provoking layers of the story. The hope of Middle-earth had lost its own hope, the king of Middle-earth was rejecting his own identity. But Sauron was unaware of this hope of Middle-earth. In his own dark and grand mind, He thought that the only power that could stand against him in the world would be the rebirth of an heir of the line of Isildur as a lofty and glorious king. Sauron had fought against the armies of Elendil and Gil-galad thousands of years ago, at the end of the Second Age. He remembered Elendil's power, the ancient blood of Númenor, and the noblest line of men. And he feared that this line, this blood, would one day rise again and stand against him. Sauron's mind was built upon power and control. He understood power, will, pride, and ambition. He expected an enemy to be aware of his own power, to want his throne, to grow in pride, and thus to become his rival. When Sauron searched for an heir of the line of Isildur, he was looking for someone who carried these qualities, this power, this pride, and this ambition. He expected a prideful prince who would raise grand armies, unfurl his banner, and reclaim his throne. But he never expected a ranger in the mud of the wilderness, one who did not know his identity, saw himself as a nothing, and carried no pride or ambition. This was one of the deepest and most thought-provoking ironies of the story. Sauron was searching for the line of Isildur, but the heir of this line saw himself as a nothing, rejected his identity, and carried no pride or ambition. Sauron's power and control were built upon pride and ambition. He could manipulate, corrupt, and enslave a person through their pride and ambition. But a man who rejects his identity, sees himself as a nothing, and carries no pride or ambition was beyond the reach of Sauron's power and control. This man, unknowingly, carried a protective shield against Sauron's greatest weapon, that power of manipulation built upon pride and ambition. Strider did not know this hidden power of seeing himself as a nothing, this natural immunity to Sauron. He saw his identitylessness as a weakness, a curse, a burden. But in truth, this identitylessness provided him a hidden protection against Sauron's greatest weapon. He did not want a throne, did not want power, carried no pride or ambition. Therefore, it was almost impossible for Sauron to seize him, manipulate him, and turn him into his instrument. Unknowingly, Strider carried the strongest weapon against the heart of darkness, against Sauron's mind, that dangerous but also protective humility brought by identitylessness. This was one of the deepest paradoxes at the heart of the story. Aragorn's identitylessness and his disbelief in himself were the source of his tragedy and his pain, but at the same time, this identitylessness and humility were a hidden weapon protecting him against Sauron's power. Not knowing that he was not a king, he possessed a power based not on the strength of a king, but on the absence of pride and ambition. And perhaps this power would become, in the darkest moments, the strongest and most unexpected shield against Sauron's darkness. And in this process, Strider, not knowing this hidden power of seeing himself as a nothing, continued to struggle with the battle within him in the midst of the wilderness. For 30 years he lived in the shadow of his own identitylessness and resentment. But unknowingly, he carried the most hidden protection of Middle-earth's deepest fate against the mind of the darkest enemy. And perhaps this hidden protection would play the most decisive and unexpected role at the end of the story. During these 30 years, Strider returned several times to Rivendell, to that old and safe valley. When he saw Arwen, that deep and unforgettable love within him flamed anew. But every time, this flame was extinguished by the cold waters of his own identitylessness and resentment. Strider did not dare approach Arwen. Because he saw himself as a nothing, he believed he did not deserve Arwen's love. Who am I, he thought, to offer my love to Arwen? I am only a wanderer lost in the wilderness, who does not know his past. How could an immortal elf woman take interest in someone like me? But Arwen could see that noble light, that ancient inheritance, and that lost king within Strider. She witnessed Strider seeing himself as a nothing, his denial of his own worth, and felt a deep sorrow within her. Arwen tried to approach Strider, to show him her love and the power within him. But every time, Strider withdrew into his own darkness, avoiding accepting this love and this power. This was that painful dance, lasting 30 years, of two hearts carrying the same love yet unable to draw near to one another. And so 30 years passed. Strider wandered all of Eriador, seeing the ancient ruins of Angmar, the old battlefields, the ruined fortresses, and the accursed forests. But nowhere could he find peace. That emptiness, that identitylessness within him followed him everywhere. He was fleeing his own fate, but he did not know what he was fleeing from. This was the most painful part of his tragedy. He lived in the shadow of an inheritance he did not know, a throne he did not know, a fate he did not know, and this shadow slowly consumed him. But Strider was unaware of this natural leadership. He always kept his distance from the group, always preferred to remain in the shadows. Within him there was a deep purposelessness, a sense of exile he could not explain. Why was he fighting? What was he protecting? These questions occupied him through the nights. In the original story, Aragorn knew he was fighting to protect his people and his future kingdom. Every swing of his sword was a step taken on the road to his throne. But for Strider, war was only a struggle for survival, a desperate way to soothe that pain and emptiness in his mind. This purposelessness slowly consumed Strider's soul. He could never attain the dignity and self-confidence of a king. His shoulders slumped, his hair turned grey at an early age, his face was deeply lined by the wind, the harsh years, and inner sorrow. By the time he was 30, he looked 40. The lively light in his eyes had been replaced by a dull, sorrowful gaze. He saw himself only as a part of the wilderness, a shadow that existed silently and would disappear silently. This subconscious loneliness and identitylessness permeated all his relationships. He always maintained his distance from the Rangers. He never opened his heart to any woman, because he could not see in himself the right to build a family, a future. He saw even his own existence as a passing wind, unable to take root anywhere. This was the darkness's greatest victory over him. Sauron had not seized his mind, but that silent exile, which severed him from himself, had become one of Sauron's greatest weapons. Meanwhile, Sauron himself was also searching for the line of Isildur. In the north, among the Dunedain, faint and ancient legends circulated that an heir of Isildur's blood still lived. Sauron's Nazgul carried out expeditions to the north to investigate these legends, to find and destroy one who came from the line of Isildur. But Strider presented the appearance of a ranger entirely devoid of that noble bearing, that royal splendor. When Sauron searched for the heir of Isildur, he expected a prideful prince who would raise grand armies, unfurl his banner, and reclaim his throne. He never expected a homeless ranger, unknown even by name, who slept among dogs in the mud of the wilderness. This situation enabled Strider's survival. But at the same time, it killed his soul. He could have been one of the greatest warriors of Middle-earth, perhaps the greatest. But he remained only that unsettling man who pined in the corners of inns, whom the people of Bree looked upon with suspicion and fear. People recoiled from his tall and dark silhouette, from those deep and sorrowful eyes, and kept their distance. He resembled not the brightness of a star, but the darkness of a shadow. And so 30 years passed. Strider wandered all of Eriador, seeing the ancient ruins of Angmar, the old battlefields, the ruined fortresses, and the accursed forests. But nowhere could he find peace. That emptiness, that identitylessness within him followed him everywhere. He was fleeing his own fate, but he did not know what he was fleeing from. This was the most painful part of his tragedy. He lived in the shadow of an inheritance he did not know, a throne he did not know, a fate he did not know, and this shadow slowly consumed him. Now we have come to the turning point of the story, to that inevitable night. It was the year 3018 of the Third Age. The shadow advancing from the east grew with each passing day, and Sauron's forces spread across Middle-earth. And in the midst of this darkness, in a small town called Bree, at the Prancing Pony Inn, 4 small travelers appeared. They were 4 hobbits from the Shire, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin. They were fleeing toward Rivendell, carrying with them the One Ring, which bore the fate of Middle-earth, to save it from the heart of darkness. But their road was made perilous by the pursuit of the Nazgul. The Black Riders followed them more closely every night. And it was on that night, in Bree, in the smoky and noisy atmosphere of the inn, that Strider first saw these 4 hobbits. And he felt the presence of the ring, that invisible shock wave created by that ancient and deadly object invisibly placed upon Frodo's finger. In that moment, something awakened within Strider. He felt that these 4 small creatures, these innocent and defenseless hobbits, were in danger and that he must protect them. But unlike the original story, Strider did not know them, and they did not know him. In the original story, Strider won the hobbits' trust through Gandalf's letter, introduced himself to them, and led them to Rivendell. But in this universe, there was no letter of trust from Gandalf for Strider. Because although Gandalf may have known Strider's true identity, Strider himself did not know it. When he approached the hobbits, all he could say to them was, "My name is Strider. I am here to protect you from the dangers of the wilderness. Follow me." The hobbits rightly hesitated to trust this strange, unsettling, and dark man. That sorrowful and deep look in his eyes both impressed and frightened them. But the fear of the Nazgul overcame this hesitation, and the hobbits, reluctantly, followed after Strider. And so a dangerous journey toward Rivendell began. Strider displayed extraordinary skill in tracking and survival, protecting the hobbits from the dark forests, the marshes, and their pursuers. But on this journey, as the hobbits came to know Strider more closely, they also began to sense that deep emptiness, that identitylessness, and that melancholy within him. Frodo, in particular, noticed the pain in Strider's eyes. "What are you searching for, Strider?" he asked one night. "Why do you help vulnerable creatures like us?" Strider could not give a clear answer to this question. because he himself did not know. He was only following the compelling feeling within him, as if protecting these hobbits was a duty he could not ignore. And finally, they reached the foot of that ancient and accursed hill called Weathertop. There, the Nazgul attacked them. Strider drew his sword in the darkness and fought bravely against the Nazgul to protect the hobbits. In that moment, it was proven once again that he was an extraordinary warrior. But the Nazgul were many, and although Strider managed to drive them off, they wounded Frodo with a blade of Mordor. Frodo collapsed to the ground with a mortal wound, that dark poison within him. This wound increased the urgency of the journey. Strider knew that only Elrond's healing could save Frodo. So he drove the hobbits, carrying the wounded Frodo on his back, without stopping, toward Rivendell. And it is precisely here that we have come to the most critical crossroads of the story. When they reached the border of Rivendell, an elf guardian personally sent by Elrond, Glorfindel, met them. And when Glorfindel stood before Strider, his face bore all the gravity and weight of Rivendell. Because when Elrond learned that the ring had appeared, that the Nine had set out, and that war was inevitably approaching, he understood that he could no longer sustain this lie, this secret. If this war was to be won, the people needed true leadership, the guidance of a king. And this leader could only be that man who carried the blood of Isildur. The true owner of Gondor's empty throne, the hope of Middle-earth, could no longer be hidden. When Glorfindel came before Strider, he whispered those historic and weighty words before the astonished hobbits. Estel, or with your true name, Aragorn. You are not an ordinary ranger. You are the true heir of the united kingdom of Gondor and Orna, descended from the line of Elendil. The blood of Isildur flows in your veins. You are a king, and a throne awaits you. These words exploded like a bomb that fundamentally shattered Strider's world and tore him apart. For a man who had believed for 30 years that he was a nothing, who had built his life upon a lie, who had lost his identity and future in the shadow of this lie, this knowledge was not a blessing, it was a betrayal that scattered his soul and emptied his insides. Strider, or rather Aragorn, seized Glorfindel by the collar, his face filled with anger, hatred, and deep pain. You lied to me, he cried. For 30 years you left me to rot in the mud of the wilderness. You raised me as a nothing, and now you expect me to become a king? This sword, this blood, this throne, mean nothing to me. I am not a king. I am only Strider. Aragorn rejected the truth. That great destruction in his mind had extinguished his self-confidence, his sense of identity, and that last spark within him. The deep trust and love he had felt for Elrond gave way to an impassable hatred and resentment. He did not accept the throne, refused to wield the broken sword Narsil, and cursed the inheritance of Isildur. But he had to keep his promise to protect the hobbits, especially the wounded Frodo. And so, with a resentful, angry, and deeply wounded soul, he led the hobbits to Rivendell. But now he was not an Estel carrying hope, he was an accursed exile, deceived by his past and at war with his own identity. This was the true beginning of the story. Because at the Council of Elrond, in that meeting where the fate of the ring was to be decided, this identityless, insecure, and angry Aragorn would have to play a decisive role in the fate of Middle-earth. But now he no longer possessed that noble power, that royal will within him. As only a ranger, a resentful and insecure man, he would set out upon this great and dangerous journey. When they reached Rivendell, the wounded Frodo was carried into Elrond's healing chambers. The poison of the Nazgul blade had seeped into Frodo, slowly consuming him. With his thousands of years of wisdom and power, Elrond made great efforts to draw out this poison. But the poison had seeped deep, and the shadow of Sauron was leaving a lasting mark upon Frodo's soul. This wound was one from which Frodo would never fully recover, a wound that would eventually drive him west, across the seas, to Valinor. While Frodo's treatment continued, Aragorn had to confront in Rivendell the man who had raised him, treated him like a father, and then committed the greatest betrayal against him, Elrond. This confrontation took place in one of the glorious halls of Rivendell, in a dark and tense atmosphere. Aragorn could no longer control his anger and resentment. Aragorn stood before Elrond, his eyes blazing with anger and pain. "Why, Elrond," he cried, his voice trembling. "Why did you lie to me for 30 years? Why did you raise me as a nothing? Why did you not tell me who I was, where I came from, what flowed in my veins? I trusted you. You were my father, my teacher, my protector. And you committed the greatest betrayal against me." Elrond took a deep breath. On his face was the weight of thousands of years, a deep expression of remorse and guilt. "You are right, Aragorn," he said, his voice soft but heavy. "I lied to you. And this was the greatest mistake of my life. But I wanted to protect you. I wanted to protect you from the curse of Isildur's inheritance, from the Eye of Sauron, and from that ancient pride. Your mother Gilraen and I thought that not telling you the truth would keep you far from this dark fate. We lied to you in order to protect you." Aragorn responded to these words with a bitter smile and anger. "To protect me," he said. "To protect me, you raised me as a nothing, in identitylessness, in resentment. To protect me, you took from me my freedom, my identity, and my fate. To protect me, you locked me in the darkest prison, the prison of my own identitylessness. That was not protection, Elrond, that was betrayal." Elrond bowed his head. "Perhaps you are right," he said, his voice filled with deep remorse. "Perhaps hiding the truth from you caused you the greatest harm. But Aragorn, know this, I have always loved you. You were like a son to me. And by keeping this secret, I caused you great pain. But at the same time, I protected you from the burden of that fate that comes with the line of Isildur. I tried to protect you from the mistakes of my own past and from that ancient curse." This confrontation left a deep and lasting mark upon Aragorn's soul. He could not fully forgive Elrond, but he understood that Elrond's intention was at least partly good. Elrond had loved him and had tried to protect him. But this protection had cost him dearly. And now, in the shadow of this cost, this identitylessness, and this resentment, Aragorn had to play a role in the fate of Middle-earth. And in the shadow of this confrontation, another deep pain in Aragorn's heart resurfaced: Arwen. When he saw Arwen in Rivendell, that deep and unforgettable love, that lost hope, flamed anew within him. But this time, this flame was not hope, but an even deeper pain. Because Aragorn now knew who he was, but this knowledge did not make him feel worthy of Arwen. On the contrary, this knowledge reminded him that he actually came from the line of Isildur, but that he rejected this fate, did not accept it, and would not sit upon its throne. But Arwen, when she looked at Aragorn, saw that deep and unforgettable love, that noble light within him. Arwen was an immortal elf woman who had lived for thousands of years. And she was ready to sacrifice her immortality for Aragorn, this mortal man. She was ready, for him, to abandon her own endless life, her own immortal future, her own people, and those immortal lands where she would set sail together with her father Elrond. But Arwen could not offer this choice to Aragorn. Because Aragorn saw himself as a nothing, did not believe in his own worth and his own fate. He did not value himself enough to accept Arwen's great sacrifice. And so, although these two hearts carried the same love, they could not draw near to one another. That light in Arwen's eyes could not illuminate that darkness in Aragorn's eyes. And this lost love would remain in both their souls as a silent and deep wound. One evening, on the terrace of Rivendell, beneath the stars, Arwen and Aragorn stood side by side. Arwen, in a soft voice, tried to express that deep feeling within her. "Aragorn, there is great power in your heart. You are a great man. And I love you. I am ready to sacrifice everything for you." But Aragorn shook his head with deep pain. "I am not worthy of love, Arwen," he said, his voice broken and weary. "I am a nothing. I am a ranger. I am a man who cannot even accept his own fate, who rejects his own identity. You are an immortal elf woman. A man like me cannot be worthy of your love." Arwen looked at these words with deep sorrow. "You insist on seeing yourself as a nothing, Aragorn," she said. "But I know who you are. I see that power, that nobility, that goodness within you. And I am in love with this power, this nobility. You must learn to see your own worth." But Aragorn answered these words by sinking into his own darkness. "How can I see my own worth, Arwen? For 30 years, I was told that I was a nothing. And now, I am told that I am actually a king. But I cannot fully accept myself in either of these two identities. I am neither fully a ranger, nor fully a king. I am a lost soul between two worlds, belonging to neither." And so, in their painful and complex relationship, Arwen and Aragorn, unable to draw near to one another, drifted apart. This lost love formed a shadow, as one of the saddest and deepest layers of the story, spreading across the entire narrative. And this shadow showed how Aragorn's identitylessness and his rejection of his fate affected not only his own life, but also the lives of those he loved. Now, in the shadow of these deep and painful inner struggles, we move to the main narrative, to the Council of Elrond and the founding of the Fellowship of the Ring. But this time, at the head of the Fellowship, stands an Aragorn who does not know the royal power within him, who sees himself only as an ordinary ranger. This is the story of how the entire journey, all the battles, and the outcome would change. And now, we move to the main narrative, to the Council of Elrond and the founding of the Fellowship of the Ring. But this time, at the head of the Fellowship, stands an Aragorn who does not know the royal power within him, who sees himself only as an ordinary ranger. This is the story of how the entire journey, all the battles, and the outcome would change. The Council of Elrond was the most important and most mysterious meeting of the Third Age. In the glorious halls of Rivendell, ambassadors from every corner of Middle-earth gathered. Elves, dwarfs, men, and hobbits, each was there as the representative of his own race, his own kingdom, and his own fate. But the true subject of the meeting was that single and deadly question on everyone's mind: what should they do with the One Ring? In the council hall, Elrond, Gandalf, the ambassadors of Galadriel, the dwarf prince Gimli, the elf prince Legolas, Boromir the captain of Gondor, and Frodo the ring-bearer came together. And in a corner stood Aragorn, a battered, resentful, and insecure man. He had not yet shaken off the shock of the devastating truth he had just learned about his own identity at this meeting. The debates of the council echoed in his ears like a hum. This council was that great and historic meeting where the fate of Middle-earth would be decided, where all races and powers came together. Elves, dwarfs, men, and hobbits had gathered in the glorious hall of Rivendell to discuss the future of the Ring and of Middle-earth. This hall was filled with the wisdom, power, and beauty of thousands of years of elves. But in the midst of this beauty and wisdom, on everyone's face, there was the shadow of the darkness, deep anxiety and helplessness. Because the ring was dangerous enough to corrupt even the most powerful beings. At the council, it was debated to whom the ring would be given, how it would be destroyed, and who would undertake this task. The debates were long, heated, and often reaching a dead end. Some proposed fighting against Sauron by using the ring. Some proposed hiding the ring somewhere and keeping it hidden. Some argued that the ring was indestructible, that it could not be fought against, and that the darkness was inevitable. But every proposal, in the face of the ring's danger, power, and corrupting influence, reached a dead end. And in the midst of these debates, Aragorn, sitting in the corner, was crushed by the weight of his own identitylessness and resentment. Among the most powerful and most wise beings of this hall, he saw himself as a nothing. Had he been a king, he could have had a say in this council, guided the people, and played a decisive role in the fate of Middle-earth. But because he rejected his identity, as only a ranger, he sat in a corner of this glorious council, silent and powerless. This was the moment when his identitylessness manifested itself, in the most painful and sharpest way, in the most glorious and most decisive setting. Gandalf argued that the ring should be given to Frodo, because a hobbit, with his small and insignificant appearance, could escape the attention of Sauron. This was an unexpected and controversial proposal. But Gandalf's proposal revealed a truth: the most powerful and most wise beings of Middle-earth could not undertake the task of destroying the ring. Because, due to their power, pride, and ambition, they might succumb to the ring's corrupting influence. Only the smallest, the most insignificant, and the most humble could undertake the task of destroying the ring. But the real matter was that the person who would carry the ring needed a leader to protect him. Frodo could not alone face the dark and dangerous lands of Mordor. He needed a powerful and loyal leader to protect him, to guide him, and to lead him all the way to Mount Doom. And this leader was none other than that resentful ranger silently sitting in the corner of the hall of Rivendell. Because Aragorn was the man who could protect the hobbits from the dangers of the wilderness, who had brought them to Rivendell, and who carried that hidden power, that quality of leadership, within him. But as this task was given to Aragorn, everyone within themselves held a doubt and uncertainty. Was this resentful, insecure, and identityless ranger truly the leader who would decide the fate of Middle-earth? Could he, not as a king but only as a ranger, undertake this great and dangerous task? These questions circulated in the minds of the council's members, but no one could give a clear answer. Because perhaps the fate of Middle-earth had been laid upon the shoulders of the most unexpected and most ordinary people, the most identityless and most resentful souls. When Elrond said that the ring should be taken to Gondor, to Minas Tirith, Boromir rose eagerly. "Gondor is our last fortress, Elrond," said Boromir, his voice filled with pride and helplessness. "It should be taken there. The power of men must stand against this threat." But Elrond shook his head. "The swords of Gondor are not enough against this enemy, Boromir," he said. "The ring leads astray everyone who seeks power. It cannot be used, only destroyed. And this task must be undertaken by the weakest and most humble, a hobbit." At these words, Frodo stepped forward. "I will take the ring," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I will carry it to Mount Doom, to the fires." A deep silence fell over the hall. Everyone was thinking of this small hobbit's great and almost impossible task. And then came Elrond's question: "But on this journey, who will accompany him? The ring-bearer cannot set out alone. A fellowship is needed to protect him." And it is at this point that everyone's eyes, reluctantly, turned to Aragorn in the corner. Because everyone, or at least a few wise elves and Gandalf, knew who this man was, that great potential within him. They saw that this resentful ranger was actually a king, the greatest hope of Middle-earth. But Aragorn himself had not yet been able to accept this truth. Gandalf approached Aragorn and whispered quietly, "Strider, your journey begins with this fellowship. Fate expects much from you." Aragorn looked at Gandalf with deep pain. "Fate has given me nothing, Gandalf," he answered. "It gave me a lie. It gave me an identitylessness. It gave me 30 years of an empty life. Now you ask me to save this fellowship." Gandalf shook his head. "I ask you only to follow the goodness and courage within you, Strider. Fate does not always come with crowns and titles. Sometimes it comes only with the resolve to do what is right." These words stirred something slightly within Aragorn, but he was still sunk in his own darkness. And so, the Fellowship of the Ring was founded. 9 members were chosen: Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Boromir, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin. Each one represented his own race and his own world. But this fellowship, unlike the original story, was founded not around an ancient prophecy or royal leadership, but as a company of strangers brought together in the shadow of necessity, doubt, and uncertainty. Aragorn stood out as the de facto leader of this fellowship, but he had come to this position not because he was the heir of Isildur, but only through his skill in tracking and his experience in the wild. For him, this journey was not a road to the crown of Gondor, it was only the responsibility of the small hobbits he had to protect. And this responsibility, in the shadow of his identitylessness and resentment, was far heavier and more complex. Boromir felt a deep unease about this situation. For Boromir, the son of Gondor's steward, a proud and noble warrior, it was impossible to understand why a ranger of uncertain identity held the position of guide in this critical task that would decide the fate of kingdoms. Boromir looked at Aragorn with suspicion and almost contempt. Who is this man, he thought. On what authority, what blood, what legitimacy does he guide us? In this great catastrophe threatening Gondor, why is it not a prince but this stranger who leads us? Boromir's suspicion, in fact, had a very deep psychological root. Gondor was a kingdom without a king for centuries. The stewards ruled the country as regents of the throne, but real power and legitimacy came from a name sitting upon the throne of the kingdom. Boromir had heard from his father Denethor's mouth many times, "Until the king comes, Gondor is not ours. We only wait. Waiting is the heaviest punishment for a steward as much as for a king." These words had opened a deep wound in Boromir's soul. Gondor's sacred throne was empty, and this emptiness pervaded every one of Boromir's thoughts. And now, as he looked at this resentful and identityless ranger sitting silently in the corner of this hall, it was hard to describe the feeling that arose within Boromir. Was this the man who would protect Frodo? Was this the man who would save the Hobbit from the curse of the ring, stand against the armies of Sauron, and change the fate of Middle-earth? As these questions chased each other in Boromir's mind, a darker feeling was emerging in his heart: jealousy. Yes, jealousy. This man wore no shining armor, had no glorious sword, and had no army to support him. But the eyes of Arwen, the Evenstar of Rivendell, held the light of 1,000 stars every time they looked at this man. Boromir was aware of this look, and it unsettled him even more. Aragorn was aware of these looks and suspicions. The burden on his shoulders was not the responsibility of a king, but the effort of a shepherd to protect his flock from wolves. At every step, at every night watch, he spent more effort to suppress that ancient call within him, the Númenórean inheritance in his blood. He wanted to remain only a ranger, to disappear into the shadows. But fate had not forgotten the line of Isildur. This tension between him and Boromir was not just a dispute over authority, it was in truth the clash of Gondor's crumbling order with the chaos of the new world, the grandeur of the past with the uncertainty of the future. And as Aragorn tried to lead, he was in fact rejecting his own existence and identity. The journey began from Rivendell southward, toward the misty and rugged mountain paths. As the Fellowship advanced through the wild lands, Aragorn's leadership was constantly tested. But he made his decisions not with the authority of a king, but with the survival instinct of a ranger. Although this was effective in some moments, in others it shook the Fellowship's trust. Especially Boromir, at every opportunity, questioned Aragorn's authority, belittled his decisions, and fought against that pride and helplessness within him. One night, around the campfire, the tension reached its peak. Boromir, unable to bear it, sharply confronted Aragorn. "Who are you to guide us, Strider? Why should we trust you? You are neither a prince nor a captain. You are only a brigand living in the wild." Aragorn felt deep pain and anger at these accusations. But he could not answer. Because in a sense, Boromir was right. Aragorn himself did not know the answer to this question. He did not know who he was, what he represented, or on what power he relied. Gandalf had to intervene in this tension. "Boromir," he said, his voice calm but heavy, "you need to trust Strider. Think less about who he is, and more about what he represents. He is the heart and the protector of this fellowship. His courage will decide the future of Middle-earth." Boromir grudgingly accepted these words, but the doubt and jealousy within him never completely died out. And this further weakened the already fragile unity of the fellowship. On these nights, as Aragorn sat alone before the fire, he struggled with that emptiness and identitylessness within him. That king he had seen in Galadriel's mirror, that throne, that splendor, all of it seemed foreign to him. He no longer knew what he was. Was he a ranger, or a king? Was he a nothing, or a hope? These questions gnawed at him through the night, causing him to wake each morning weary and resentful. And the journey continued. The fellowship tried to cross the snowy slopes of the Pass of Caradhras, but the fury of nature and the shadow of Sauron turned them back. Against their will, they had to enter a dangerous and dark road, the depths of Moria. And it is here, in Moria, that the Fellowship and Aragorn faced their first great test. Here, in the heart of darkness and death, everything would change. Moria, the dwarf realm of Khazad-dûm, was the tomb of a civilization lost in the depths of history. The dwarfs had built this magnificent underground kingdom thousands of years ago and buried their gold and treasures here. But those deep pits they dug had eventually awakened a sleeping terror, the Balrog, and Moria had become the tomb of the dwarfs. Now, in this dark and accursed place, only death and oblivion dwelled. When the Fellowship stepped through the dark gate of Moria, a suffocating, heavy, and cold darkness fell upon them. The torches and the light of Gandalf's magic provided a faint illumination in these endless tunnels. Aragorn was accustomed to moving through this darkness as a ranger, the night was his home. But the darkness of Moria was different. This darkness was not merely the absence of light, it was the crystallized form of thousands of years of despair, pain, and death. This darkness was, as it were, alive, breathing, and waiting to swallow them. As Aragorn advanced through this darkness, he struggled with that identitylessness and fear within him. Had he been a king, he would have known how to guide this group. But as only a ranger, he was trying to find his way through this dark labyrinth. Gandalf had taken up the guidance of the group, he knew the paths and the history of Moria. But Aragorn felt that he was the protector of this group, that he had to save them. And when this responsibility combined with his identitylessness, it crushed his shoulders even more. As they advanced into the depths of Moria, the group encountered many dangers. In the dark corridors, echoing sounds announced the approach of a terror tracking them. And then, that moment came. From the depths, from beneath the earth, that ancient and deadly being that had slept for thousands of years awakened. The Balrog, made of flame and shadow, awakened a divine terror. As the group fled from the Balrog's shadow through the vast halls of Moria, that glorious and terrible confrontation took place between Gandalf and the Balrog upon the bridge. Gandalf stood upon the bridge, struck the ground with his staff, and destroyed the bridge. "You shall not pass," he cried. But the Balrog, clinging to the fragments of the shattered bridge, dragged Gandalf down with him into the depths of the darkness. Gandalf, with one last look, turned to the group and shouted, "Flee!" And then, the two of them, in that terrible duel of flame and shadow, fell into the deep chasms of Moria. This moment, Gandalf's fall, was one of the most tragic and most decisive moments in the lives of the Fellowship and of Aragorn. Gandalf was not only the most powerful member of the Fellowship, but also its soul, mind, and guide. He was that wise being who guided the Fellowship, offered them ancient wisdom, calmed their fears, and kept their hopes alive. He was both a teacher, a father, a captain, and a friend. And now, when he fell into that dark chasm, the Fellowship had lost its strongest pillar, its brightest light. Gandalf's fall was for the Fellowship not only a physical loss, but the disappearance of a spiritual compass, a father, a guide. Aragorn realized with horror in that moment that there was no one left to direct them, to offer them ancient wisdom, to calm their fears. Gandalf was the soul and mind of the group. And now he was gone. What remained was Aragorn, an identityless, insecure ranger, and a group filled with fear. Aragorn, in the dark corridors of Moria, at the edge of that chasm where Gandalf had fallen, was left alone with that deep loss and helplessness within him. For a moment, he thought of stepping into this darkness, following after Gandalf. Perhaps, he thought, I too should fall with him. Perhaps I am not someone who can lead this group. Perhaps I am a nothing who does not know his identity, who rejects his fate, and who can accomplish nothing. These thoughts tore Aragorn's soul apart, dragging him into the darkest and most hopeless corners within him. But just at that moment, Aragorn saw Frodo and the others standing beside him. They were looking at him with fear and despair, with questioning looks in their eyes. They were now looking to him as their sole leader. Gandalf was gone, the Fellowship's guide, protector, and hope was now Aragorn. And Aragorn understood that he had to take up this responsibility, this heavy burden, that despite his fear, despite his identitylessness, despite his insecurity, he had to protect and guide this group. Aragorn took a deep breath, suppressed that fear and helplessness within him, and took the lead of the group. Not like a king, with glorious authority, but like a desperate and resolute ranger, with his survival instinct, he tried to lead the group out of this dark labyrinth. "Follow me," said Aragorn, his voice trembling but resolute. "I will lead you out of this darkness. Trust me." These words were not the challenge of a king, but the last and desperate promise of a ranger. But within this promise there was devotion, courage, and the determination to save the group. Aragorn led the group through the dark and dangerous corridors of Moria. He found his tracks with a ranger's hunter instinct, in the darkness and in the shadow of death. He led the group through Moria's dark halls, down its fallen stairways, and through its ancient doors. And at every step, that identitylessness and insecurity within him fought with him. "Am I someone who can save this group?" he thought. "I am a nothing who does not know his identity. How can I lead?" But despite these questions, he carried the group forward, trying to lead them out of the darkness. And finally, the group emerged from the dark gate of Moria into the light of day. The sunlight dazzled their eyes, but that darkness and that sense of loss in their hearts did not fade. Gandalf's absence hung over the Fellowship like a cloud. And this cloud, especially over Aragorn, combining with the weight of his identitylessness and insecurity, crushed him even more. He had saved the group, but within him, the feeling that he could not fill Gandalf's place, that he was not a king, and that he had not fully protected the group, would remain as a deep and lasting wound. At the gate of Moria, Aragorn looked into the darkness where Gandalf had fallen. His eyes were lost in the depths of that chasm. Within him was an indescribable pain, a loss, and a helplessness. For a moment, he thought of stepping into this darkness, following after Gandalf. But then he saw Frodo and the others standing beside him. They were looking at him in fear and despair. Aragorn, as a ranger, knew he could not abandon this group. But at the same time, he could not find within himself the power to lead them like a king. Legolas came to Aragorn's side. The elf's eyes were filled with deep sorrow and concern. "Aragorn, we must continue," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "Gandalf fought for us. We cannot waste his sacrifice. Tell us what we must do." These words placed a great burden upon Aragorn. The word, leader, settled upon him like a heavy responsibility. He was not a leader. He was a nothing. But at this moment, he had no other choice. Aragorn took a deep breath and gathered his voice. "We will go to Lothlorien," he said, his voice harsh but fragile. "We will ask for Galadriel's help. She will guide us." This decision was the first great leadership decision Aragorn made on his own, without Gandalf. But within this decision, there was more of a ranger's helplessness than a king's authority. He did not fully know what to do, he was only trying to survive and to save the group. The group found their way out of Moria and emerged once more into the light of day. The sunlight dazzled their eyes, but that darkness and that sense of loss in their hearts did not fade. Gandalf's absence hung over the Fellowship like a cloud. And this cloud, especially over Aragorn, combining with the weight of his identitylessness and insecurity, crushed him even more. When they reached Lothlorien, that glorious and mystical realm of the elves, an entirely different test began for Aragorn. Lothlorien was the realm of golden-leaved trees, of dark but peaceful forests, and of thousands of years of elf wisdom. Here, Galadriel and Celeborn, the most powerful and most wise lords of the elves, welcomed the Fellowship. And Galadriel, with her eyes, pierced into the depths of Aragorn's soul. Galadriel was the most powerful and most wise elf woman of the Noldor, who had lived for thousands of years. She knew the line of Isildur, the inheritance of Elendil, and Aragorn's true identity. But she also knew that in this universe, Aragorn did not know this identity, that he saw himself as a nothing. Galadriel looked at Aragorn with deep compassion and sorrow. In this resentful and identityless ranger, she saw the tragedy of a lost king, of an extinguished hope. One night, Galadriel summoned Aragorn and led him before the mirror, one of the most mysterious and most mighty works of the elves. "Aragorn," said Galadriel, her voice soft but heavy, "this mirror shows the past, the present, and the future. But it also reflects whatever lies in the depths of your heart. Look into the mirror, and whatever you see, face it." Aragorn looked into the mirror with hesitation. In the mirror, Aragorn did not see a king. He saw a reflection of those complex and dark emotions within him. In the mirror, he saw that peaceful but lie-filled childhood spent in Rivendell, that 30 years of purposeless and empty life spent in the midst of the wilderness. In the mirror, he saw Arwen's beautiful and unattainable face and that love he could never live with her. And in the mirror, in the deepest places, he saw that lost king, that extinguished hope, that fate that would never come to pass. This vision filled Aragorn's insides with indescribable pain. But the mirror was not only showing him the past and the future, it was also bringing to the surface what lay hidden in the deepest corners of his heart, those fears and desires in his subconscious. As Aragorn watched that complex and contradictory reflection of his face and his soul in the mirror's water, a sense of discovery, a feeling of illumination arose within him. He began to understand that these images were a reflection not only of the past and the future, but also of his own inner world. As Aragorn stood before the mirror, he became aware of those complex emotions within him. At the same time, he was both afraid and hoping. He both fled and wanted to draw near. He both hated his fate and longed for it. These contradictions revealed the deepest and most real face of his soul. And perhaps, for the first time, Aragorn was beginning to face these complex and contradictory emotions within him, this mixture of fear and hope, of flight and longing. Galadriel watched Aragorn's inner journey, is facing these complex and contradictory emotions. In the depths of Aragorn's soul, she saw the trace of that lost king, the spark of that extinguished hope. And Galadriel felt deep compassion and sorrow within her. "Aragorn," said Galadriel, her voice soft and filled with deep wisdom. "A great war is taking place in your heart. But this war is a war waged not against the enemy outside, but against that fear and that longing within you. And winning this war is harder than winning all the wars outside." Aragorn sank into a deep silence at these words. He felt that Galadriel's words exactly described those complex and contradictory emotions within him, that fear and that longing, that flight and that drawing near. "Galadriel," said Aragorn, his voice trembling and resentful, "I do not know how to cope with this war within me. I am afraid. I am afraid of my fate, of my identity, of myself. And at the same time, I long. I long for that kingdom, that hope, that fate that I lost. These contradictions tear me apart." Galadriel, with a soft smile, looked at Aragorn with a compassionate gaze. "These contradictions, Aragorn, do not tear you apart, they define you," she said. "Fear and hope, flight and longing, these are the deepest and most real parts of the human soul. You must learn to live with these contradictions, these complex emotions. Rather than fleeing from them, you must learn to accept them. Because only then can you win that war within you and find your true identity." This conversation left a deep and lasting mark upon Aragorn's soul. He could not immediately fully accept Galadriel's words, but within him, for the first time, a feeling of illumination, a crumb of hope appeared. Perhaps identity had less to do with titles and crowns, and more with a person making peace with those complex and contradictory emotions, that fear and that longing, within himself. And this thought cast upon Aragorn's inner darkness the first real crumb of light reflected from Galadriel's mirror. Galadriel noticed Aragorn's pain and spoke in a soft voice, "Aragorn, there is great power in your heart. But you refuse to see this power. You insist on seeing yourself as a nothing. But fate sees you not as a nothing, but as a king." Aragorn shook his head. "I am not a king, Galadriel," he said, his voice painful and resentful. "I am only a ranger deceived by his past. This throne, this inheritance, was given to me as a lie. I do not want them." Galadriel sighed. "Power, Aragorn, does not always come with crowns and titles," she said. "Sometimes, the greatest power is born in the darkest and most desperate moments, from the depths of the heart. You possess that power. You only need to learn to accept it." But Aragorn could not fully accept these words. The wound within him was not simple enough to heal immediately with Galadriel's wise words. The time spent in Lothlorien gave the Fellowship peace and hope. Galadriel gave them gifts and strengthened them to continue on their way. But when the time of parting came, that uncertainty and fragility brought by Gandalf's absence and Aragorn's identitylessness still held their weight over the Fellowship. As the Fellowship advanced southward along the river, toward their fate, all of them wondered within themselves how this journey would end. And then, that inevitable moment came. At Amorn Hen, in the shadow of the ring, the Fellowship broke apart. Boromir was seized by the lure of the ring, attacked Frodo, and Frodo, to protect himself, had to flee with only Sam. Merry and Pippin were taken captive by the Uruk-hai. Boromir gave his life protecting the hobbits. And the Fellowship, split into 4, shattered. But what happened at Amorn Hen was not so short and simple. Boromir's downfall was the tragic result of an internal war lasting days, a wearying resistance against the lure of the ring. Boromir had been hearing the whispers of the ring since Rivendell. That small golden ring, every night, every moment, whispered to him the promises of power, of glory, and of saving Gondor. As Boromir thought of Gondor's helplessness, the falling defenders of Minas Tirith, and the sorrow on his father Denethor's face, the lure of the ring grew ever stronger. Boromir was experiencing within himself the war of two opposing forces. On one side, as a noble, honorable, and good man, there was the loyalty of the fellowship and of duty. On the other side, there was the desire of a proud and desperate warrior, ready to do anything to save Gondor, who believed he could use the power of the ring. Between these two forces, Boromir fought a silent and lonely war for days. And this war, in the face of the ring's weight and Gondor's helplessness, slowly drew him ever deeper into the darkness. At Amon Hen, on that decisive day, Boromir finally lost this internal war. When he found Frodo alone at the edge of the forest, that dark desire within him overcame all his loyalty and honor. Boromir, pleading, using force, demanded the ring from Frodo. "You must do it for Gondor," cried Boromir, with a dark glint in his eyes. "Give me the ring. I will use it to save it. Only for Gondor, only for my people." But Frodo put on the ring, became invisible, and fled. Boromir, falling to his knees, became aware of the betrayal he had committed, and a great remorse and sorrow arose within him. "Frodo, what have I done?" he muttered. "Forgive me. I only wanted to save my people." This moment of Boromir's was the deepest and most moving moment of his tragedy and of the weakness of human nature. Boromir was not an evil man, he was only a very weak moment, too weary and desperate to resist the lure of the ring. He loved Gondor, and this love dragged him into the darkness. This showed us that even the most well-intentioned people can succumb to weakness in the face of the darkest desires and the heaviest burdens. Boromir's tragedy was not the fall of a hero, but the tragedy of the limits of man and the lure of power. Shortly afterward, while protecting the hobbits, Merry and Pippin, Boromir was severely wounded by the arrows of the Uruk-hai. As he died, in Aragorn's arms, with his last words, he expressed his remorse for his betrayal and his faith in his humanity. "Your people," said Aragorn to Boromir, granting him one last honor and assurance before he died. But as Boromir closed his eyes, with that deep love for Gondor and that last loyalty to the Fellowship still within him, he whispered, "Save Gondor," and took his last breath. Boromir's death was a deep wound for Aragorn. Aragorn thought that he could not save Boromir, could not turn him from this dark path, and could not hold the Fellowship together. "If I had been a king," thought Aragorn, as he released Boromir's cooling hand, "I could have saved this man. I could have held this Fellowship together. I could have prevented this tragedy." This thought caused Aragorn's identitylessness and his sense of failure to remain in his soul as the deepest wound. Boromir's death was not only the loss of a warrior, it was also that tragic turning point where Aragorn questioned his faith in himself and his ability to lead. This breaking apart was the deepest crisis point for Aragorn. Had he been a king, he could have held this Fellowship together, prevented Boromir's weakness, and protected the hobbits. But as only a ranger, he could not prevent the Fellowship's breaking apart. He had to take up the leadership of the group in Gandalf's absence, but he could not do it, because he had lost his confidence in himself, his identity, and his faith in his fate. This failure tore Aragorn's soul apart. Together with Legolas and Gimli, he set out in pursuit of the Uruk-hai to rescue the captured Merry and Pippin. This pursuit was a desperate run lasting days across the wide plains of Rohan. In this pursuit, Aragorn acted only like a hunter, with his survival and revenge instinct. But within him, that identitylessness and that sense of failure followed him at every step. But the breaking apart of the Fellowship was only half of Aragorn's journey. The fate of Middle-earth, in truth, had been laid upon the shoulders of two small hobbits, in the east, in the heart of darkness. Frodo and Sam, carrying the ring, had set out upon a desperate and dangerous journey toward the terrible and accursed lands of Mordor, toward Mount Doom. And this journey formed the true and most important part of Aragorn's war, of all those glorious armies and the struggle of kings. Frodo and Sam, after that inevitable moment of breaking apart at Amon Hen, turned eastward, toward the steep and rocky hills of Emyn Muil. Frodo felt the weight and the lure of the ring more and more with every passing moment. That small, seemingly harmless golden ring was slowly seizing the mind of its bearer, consuming him ever more and pushing him into the darkness. Sam, however, the faithful and brave gardener, never left his master alone on this difficult and dark journey. His pure love, his loyalty, and that ordinary but immense courage were the strongest light of this hopeless journey. The journey of these two hobbits, unlike the battles of glorious armies and famed heroes, was for the most part a silent, dark, and painful struggle. They fought against hunger, thirst, weariness, and fear. They crawled across rugged terrain, through dark marshes, and across accursed lands. And at every moment, they felt upon them the pressure of Sauron's terrible and invisible eye, that immense and watching eye. Reaching Mordor was in itself an impossible task. Dark and sharp mountains surrounded Mordor's southern border, and immense and impassable walls its northern. Frodo and Sam knew only one way to enter this terrible fortress-like realm, Cirith Ungol, the Spider's Pass. But this pass was home to the lair of a terrible creature, the giant spider Shelob, and an accursed fortress. Along the way, Frodo and Sam found a guide, Gollum. That old and corrupted hobbit who had carried the ring had wandered for thousands of years in pursuit of this ancient and deadly object. Gollum led Frodo and Sam, along with his obsession with the ring and his dark plans, into the terrible lands of Mordor. But Gollum's loyalty was uncertain and dangerous. He both worshipped the ring and wanted to reclaim it. This complex and dark soul made Frodo and Sam's journey even more dangerous. Under Gollum's guidance, Frodo and Sam passed through the dark and breathtaking forests of Ithilien, across the terrible and ghost-filled plains of the Dead Marshes. In the Dead Marshes, the ghosts of warriors drowned thousands of years ago glowed like candles floating on the surface of the water, displaying the chilling visions of past battles and deaths. This dark and suffocating atmosphere darkened Frodo's soul even further, making the weight and lure of the ring even more unbearable. And then, they came to Cirith Ungol, that terrible and accursed pass. Here, Gollum's betrayal was revealed. He wanted to draw Frodo and Sam into the lair of the giant spider Shelob. Shelob was a giant and deadly spider who had lived in this dark pass for thousands of years. She would wrap her victims in her web, paralyze them with her poison, and slowly, terribly consume them in her dark lair. But on this dark journey, Gollum's character deepened as one of the most complex and most tragic figures of the narrative. Gollum was in fact once a creature named Smeagol, a cheerful and curious hobbit-like being. Together with his friend Deagol, he had discovered at the bottom of a river something gleaming, the One Ring. And in that moment, the ancient and deadly lure of the ring corrupted Smeagol, transforming him into Gollum. The ring had become his precious, swallowing all his love, all his mind, and all his life. Gollum had lived for hundreds of years, alone and corrupted, in the depths of the dark mountains. That obsession with the ring had made him both a victim and a hunter. And now, as he led Frodo and Sam into Mordor, two opposing forces warred within him, that dark and obsessive desire for the ring, and those uncertain and complex feelings he held for Frodo and these innocent creatures. One moment Gollum wanted to help Frodo, the next he wanted to destroy him and reclaim the ring. This internal conflict tore Gollum's soul apart, making him both a pitiable and a terrible figure. Frodo felt a compassion and understanding for Gollum. Frodo could sense that the darkness within Gollum was in fact a result of the ring and of his own weakness, that he was actually an innocent and lost soul. Frodo thought, it could have happened to me too. The power of the ring could have made me like this. Therefore, Frodo showed compassion to Gollum, spoke with him, and tried to awaken the goodness within him. But the darkness within Gollum, despite the light of this compassion, grew ever greater. Sam, however, looked at Gollum with an entirely different eye. Sam saw that Gollum was dangerous and untrustworthy, and felt deep suspicion and hatred toward him. He will betray us, Sam kept saying. There is evil in his eyes. We must not trust him. Sam's common sense and protective instinct would play an important role in the survival of Frodo and Sam. But at the same time, Sam's hatred and distrust of Gollum further fed the darkness within Gollum, pushing him toward betrayal. While passing through the forests of Ithilien, Frodo, Sam, and Gollum encountered a hidden group of men, the Ithilien Rangers of Gondor, led by Faramir. Faramir, Denethor's younger son, was a noble and wise captain of Gondor. Unlike Boromir, Faramir was a more thoughtful, more compassionate, and less arrogant man. He was a leader who cared about the soul and goodness of people and rejected the desire for power. When Faramir captured Frodo and Sam, he understood that they carried the ring and were going to Mordor. He had the opportunity to seize the ring, take it to Gondor, and use its power. But Faramir, unlike Boromir, resisted this law. He knew the danger of the ring's power and understood its corrupting influence. This thing is not ours, said Faramir to Frodo. I will not be caught by the lure of this object. I understand your task, the task of destroying this ring. And I will help you, I will not betray you. This was a rare moment of goodness and wisdom in the story. Faramir was one of the rare men who resisted the power of the ring. He did what Boromir could not, he resisted the lure of the ring and remained loyal to his task. This showed that humanity, even in the shadow of Sauron, could still carry goodness, wisdom, and devotion. Faramir released Frodo and Sam, gave them food and guidance, and sent them on their way to continue their task. Faramir's virtuous behavior gave a light of hope to the souls of Frodo and Sam. They saw that there was still goodness within humanity, that not everyone was caught by the lure of the ring. And this hope gave them strength to continue their dark and difficult journey. Faramir, as one of the most noble and most thought-provoking figures of the narrative, proved that resisting the power of the ring, goodness and wisdom were possible. Meanwhile, in the east, while this hopeful encounter of Frodo and Sam was taking place, in the west, in Rohan, Aragorn's story continued. In the time Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli spent in Rohan, they found themselves on the eve of a great war. Sauron's armies were advancing toward Gondor, and Rohan was preparing against this darkness. In this process, the rebirth and wisdom of Gandalf were an important part of the narrative. In that terrible duel in the depths of Moria, Gandalf had fallen into the chasm of darkness together with the Balrog. But he had not died in that chasm. He had entered a legendary duel with the Balrog, lasting days, from the depths of the mountains to the peaks. And finally, he had defeated the Balrog, destroying it upon the mountain's peak. But this victory had cost Gandalf dearly. In this process he had died, but was reborn as a more powerful and more wise being. With this rebirth, Gandalf was no longer the grey, but the white. He had taken Saruman's place, inheriting his power and wisdom. Gandalf the White was now a more powerful, more resolute, and more enlightened being. He was ready to play a more active and more decisive role in the fate of Middle-earth. And his rebirth was a powerful symbol of goodness and hope in the midst of darkness and despair. When Gandalf came to Aragorn's side in Rohan, he saw that darkness and identitylessness within him. Gandalf, with his wise and gentle guidance, tried to give Aragorn hope once again. "Aragorn," said Gandalf, his voice soft but strong, "there is great power within you. You must accept your fate. You are from the line of Isildur, and this is not a curse, but a duty. You are the hope of Middle-earth. You are the light standing against this darkness." But Aragorn responded to Gandalf's words with deep pain. "Gandalf, I cannot accept my fate," he said. "For 30 years, I was told that I was a nothing. And now, I am told that I am a king. But I cannot accept myself in either of these two identities. I am not at peace with my own identity, my own fate. I cannot sit upon my throne as a king, because I cannot see myself as a king." Gandalf looked at these words with deep understanding. "Identity, Aragorn, is not only a name," he said. "Identity is a behavior, a choice, a devotion. Even without knowing that you are a king, you can act like a king. With your courage, your wisdom, and your devotion, even without knowing that you are a king, you can be a king. Titles are only labels. True nobility lies within the heart." These words awakened a deep resonance in Aragorn's soul. But he could not immediately fully accept this wisdom. The wound within him was still deep and ached. But Gandalf's words cast upon Aragorn's inner darkness the first real crumb of light. Perhaps the truth that identity lies not in titles and crowns, but in behaviors and choices, was slowly beginning to open before Aragorn. And in this process, Thorodin, the king of Rohan, was preparing for a last resistance against Sauron's armies. Thorodin gathered the cavalry of Rohan to rush to the aid of Gondor. This was one of the greatest and most daring campaigns in Rohan's history. And Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli prepared to join this campaign. But Aragorn decided to take a darker and more hopeless road, the paths of the dead. To save Gondor, perhaps without accepting his own identity and fate, he was ready to make one last sacrifice. And it is at this point that we return to the most critical and most tragic crossroads of the story, to that confrontation on the paths of the dead. Frodo had to face that terrible and dark creature in Shelob's lair. With the sword in his hand and that small but mighty lamp given by Galadriel, he fought a helpless and hopeless struggle against Shelob. But Shelob was powerful and deadly. In the end, Frodo was paralyzed by Shelob's poison and fell into a dark and cold numbness. When Sam saw his master in this state, with that pure love and courage within him, he attacked Shelob alone. And incredibly, Sam, with his courage and that ordinary sword, managed to badly wound and drive off this giant and terrible creature. Sam rescued the wounded and unconscious Frodo from Shelob's lair. But immediately afterward, the orcs in the accursed fortress of Cirith Ungol captured Frodo, together with the ring upon him, and carried him into the fortress. Sam, to rescue his master, alone infiltrated that terrible and accursed fortress. Taking advantage of the orcs' quarrels and chaos, he found Frodo and rescued him. And then, the two of them together began their last and most difficult march into the terrible and accursed lands of Mordor, toward the heart of darkness. But on this dark and hopeless journey, Sam's story became the most powerful, most moving, and most unforgettable part of the story. Samwise Gamgee, that ordinary and faithful gardener from the Shire, had never wanted to be a hero. He only loved his master Frodo, was loyally bound to him, and never wanted to leave him alone on this dark and dangerous journey. Sam did not understand wars, armies, and kings. He only wanted to protect the master he loved and lead him to Mount Doom. And this simple, pure, and unshakable love made Sam the most powerful and most heroic soul of this hopeless journey. In Shelob's lair, facing the giant and terrible spider, to protect his master, Sam fought alone with that pure love and courage within him. With an ordinary sword, he resisted this giant creature, wounded it, and drove it off. To rescue his master, Sam alone infiltrated the terrible and accursed fortress of Cirith Ungol. Among the orcs, he searched for his master, found him, and rescued him. And on this terrible and hopeless journey, he carried Frodo into the heart of darkness, to Mount Doom, and never gave up. Sam's story showed us that heroism lies not in power and courage, but in love, loyalty, and devotion. Sam had never been a swordsman, a warrior, or a leader. He was only an ordinary gardener who wanted to protect the master he loved. But this love, this loyalty, and this devotion made him one of the greatest and most unforgettable heroes of Middle-earth. Sam never wore a crown, wielded a sword, or fought at the head of an army. But with his love and loyalty, he accomplished far more than the greatest armies and the most powerful kings. He led his master into the heart of darkness, to Mount Doom, and became the most important part of the salvation of Middle-earth. And on this journey, Frodo's burden became increasingly unbearable. The ring consumed Frodo more and more with every passing moment, weakening him ever further and drawing him into the darkness. Frodo was crushed under the weight of the ring, his soul and body exhausted. But Sam was always by his side. He carried Frodo, fed him, warmed him, and gave him hope. "I will carry you," said Sam, at one moment, to Frodo, in the dark and ash-covered lands of Mordor. "I will lead you out of this darkness. I will carry you to Mount Doom, all the way there. I will always look after you." These words, this simple and pure love, kept Frodo on his feet on this hopeless and dark journey. Sam and Frodo crawled across the dark and accursed lands of Mordor for days and weeks. They fought against hunger, thirst, weariness, and fear. The ring was consuming Frodo, but Sam kept him on his feet. Sam's loyalty, love, and devotion were the most powerful and brightest light of this hopeless journey. And finally, they reached the terrible and shaking slope of Mount Doom. There, in the heart of darkness and death, these two small hobbits prepared to take that last and most difficult step that would decide the fate of Middle-earth. And this was the most critical and most decisive moment of the story, the moment these two small, ordinary, and faithful souls advanced, in the heart of darkness, toward that last struggle between despair and hope. The interior of Mordor was like a hell. Vast plains covered in black ash and lava, terrible and sharp mountains, and everywhere, Sauron's countless armies moved in the shadow of his glorious but dark will. Frodo and Sam advanced through this terrible and accursed land, crawling and hiding in the shadows, among the rocks and ashes. The ring consumed Frodo more and more with every passing moment. He grew ever more weary, weak, and drawn into the darkness. But Sam kept him on his feet, gave him hope, and carried him forward. Meanwhile, in the west, the adventure of Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli continued. After pursuing the Uruk-hai, they had reached the wide and open plains of Rohan. He had not died in that glorious and terrible duel with the Balrog, but had been reborn as a more powerful and whiter form, Gandalf the White. Gandalf came to Rohan, freed the old king from Grima's evil influence, and re-illuminated his mind and will. Thorodin once again became a strong and resolute king. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli met Thorodin and his niece Eowyn in Edoras. Eowyn, the White Lady of Rohan, was a beautiful, brave princess but in deep sorrow and helplessness. She was a warrior whose right to fight and win honor had been taken from her as a woman. She developed an admiration and a deep feeling for Aragorn at first sight. Because Eowyn could feel that dark and noble pain, that hidden power in Aragorn's eyes. Eowyn was one of the most powerful and most unforgettable characters of the story. She was the princess of Rohan, but in the court, in the shadow of a throne, she lived as a woman who could not control her fate. She was a warrior, but as a woman, her right to wield a sword and to fight had been taken from her. She was in a search for honor and victory, but this search was imprisoned within the walls of society and tradition. Eowyn lived the pain of being unable to express, as a woman, that power, that courage, and that ambition within her, as deep sorrow and helplessness. When Eowyn saw Aragorn, she could feel that dark and noble pain in his eyes, that hidden power, and that identitylessness. The two, though by different paths, shared a similar pain, a similar confinement, and a similar search for identity. Aragorn was a man who rejected his identity, saw himself as a nothing. Eowyn, however, was an imprisoned warrior who could not express her identity and power as a woman. This shared pain, this shared search, formed a deep and complex bond between the two. Eowyn developed an admiration and a deep feeling for Aragorn. She saw that noble power, that courage, and that quality of leadership within Aragorn and, as it were, begged him to accept this power, to find this identity. "You are not aware of yourself," said Eowyn, one night, in the glorious Hall of Adorers, with deep light in her eyes. "You are a great man. But you refuse to see it. You are fleeing from something. You, just like me, have imprisoned your own power and identity. But I see that power within you." These words awakened a deep resonance in Aragorn's soul. He understood that Eowyn had imprisoned that power and identity within herself, that like himself she was constrained and helpless. But Aragorn could not accept this interest, this love of Eowyn's. Within him he carried a deep and unforgettable love for Arwen, the even star of Rivendell. And because he saw himself as a nothing, he believed he was not worthy of offering this love to either Arwen or Eowyn. Toward Eowyn, he approached like a brother, like a friend, admiring her courage and beauty, but unable to open his heart to her. This was, for Eowyn, a deep and devastating pain. She had offered her love to Aragorn, but Aragorn had not accepted this love. Eowyn felt, once again, her power and identity imprisoned, her desire and love rejected. As both a woman imprisoned within the walls of society, and as a woman whose love had been rejected, she lived deep sorrow and helplessness. But this sorrow and helplessness did not extinguish the courage and determination within Eowyn. On the contrary, this pain drove her to change her own fate, to prove her own power and identity. And this pain drove Eowyn to the battlefield, disguised, to change her fate. She dressed as a man, joined the cavalry of Rohan, and threw herself into battle to protect her uncle Durotan. She no longer wanted to be imprisoned as a woman, she wanted to win her honor and victory as a warrior. And on the Pelennor fields, in the most terrible moment of the battle, facing the Witch King, she would both change her own fate and play a decisive role in the salvation of Middle-earth. This would be that glorious and unforgettable moment when Eowyn proved to the whole world, not as a woman but as a warrior, her power and identity. This complex and painful relationship, this deep bond between Eowyn and Aragorn, and this rejected love, formed one of the saddest and deepest layers of the story. In Aragorn, Eowyn had seen an imprisoned soul like herself, constrained power like her own, and had, as it were, begged him to escape this prison, to accept this power. But Aragorn, in the shadow of his own identitylessness and disbelief in himself, could not answer this call. And this was the tragedy of two powerful and courageous souls, in their search to escape the same prison and find the same identity, being unable to complete one another and being separated. But Aragorn could not respond to this interest. Within him he carried a deep and unforgettable love for Arwen, the even star of Rivendell. But at the same time, in this universe, because he saw himself as a nothing, he thought that this love for Arwen was for him not a hope, but only a painful memory. Toward Eowyn, he approached like a brother, like a friend, admiring her courage and beauty, but unable to open his heart to her. This complex and painful relationship formed one of the saddest and deepest layers of the story. In this period spent in Rohan, Aragorn's identitylessness and insecurity showed itself once again, but this time in a different way. Eowyn was showing him his true identity, that great power within him. "You are not aware of yourself," said Eowyn, one night, with deep light in her eyes. "You are a great man. But you refuse to see it. You are fleeing from something." But Aragorn answered these words with that deep resentment within him. "I am a nothing, Eowyn. And a nothing cannot flee from anything." This dialogue revealed the deep wounds in both their souls. Meanwhile, the story of the Ents, the shepherds of the trees, was also an important part of the narrative. Merry and Pippin had been captured by the Uruk-hai, but at the edge of Rohan, in Fangorn Forest, in the lands of the Ents, they had escaped. Here they met the old and wise tree shepherd Treebeard. Merry and Pippin told Treebeard and the other Ents that Saruman was trying to destroy Fangorn Forest, to cut down the trees, and to increase his power. This angered and moved the Ents to action. The old and patient Ents, for the first time, emerged from their ancient and calm nature and entered the war. They marched upon Isengard, Saruman's fortress. The giant and mighty tree shepherds, with their immense and ancient power, destroyed Saruman's glorious but dark fortress. Isengard was laid waste by the anger of the Ents, and Saruman lost his power and his armies. This was an important and decisive part of the war. One of Sauron's most important allies had thus been eliminated. Meanwhile, in the west, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli remained in Rohan as Theoden's guests. Thorodin, that powerful and newly awakened king, showed Aragorn deep respect and friendship. But within the Odin there was deep concern about his own fate and the future of Rohan. Sauron's armies were drawing closer every day, and Rohan could not stand alone against this darkness. And then, that inevitable and decisive moment came. Sauron had launched a great attack against Gondor, against Minas Tirith. The Odin gathered the cavalry of Rohan and prepared to rush to the aid of Gondor. To save Gondor, Aragorn decided to take a darker and more hopeless road, the paths of the dead. And it is at this point that we return to the most critical and most tragic crossroads of the story, to that confrontation on the paths of the dead. During this pursuit, Aragorn's leadership was tested in his relationship with Legolas and Gimli. These two companions looked at him with different eyes. Legolas could sense that noble light, that lost king within Aragorn, approaching him with hope and respect. Gimli, however, with the dwarf's pure and judgmental nature, noticed Aragorn's identitylessness and insecurity, but still maintained his loyalty to him. These two companions were two thin branches clinging to Aragorn in his darkness. But the greatest crisis occurred on the paths of the dead. In Rohan, after seeing the hospitality of the Odin and Eowyn, Aragorn understood that to save Gondor he had to enter a dark and accursed road, the paths of the dead. This road was the place where the accursed spirits of a warrior king, who had sworn an oath of loyalty to the line of Isildur and then broken that oath, dwelled. These dead would bow only to a king, to the heir of Isildur. But Aragorn did not know that he was the heir of Isildur. As only a ranger, he was entering this accursed road. When he stepped upon the paths of the dead, a cold wind struck his face, and thousands of voices, the ghostly voices of spirits whispering, weeping, and crying, echoed in his ears. And then, the ghostly king of Dunharrow, that glorious and terrible being, appeared before Aragorn. This encounter, in the dark and crushing atmosphere of the paths of the dead, was one of the most critical and most decisive moments of the story. The paths of the dead were the accursed lands of warriors who, thousands of years ago, had sworn an oath of loyalty to the line of Isildur, to the inheritance of Elendil, and then broken this oath. These warriors had sworn their loyalty to the king, but in the face of darkness they had broken this oath and fled. And this betrayal had condemned them to live forever as restless and accursed spirits in the paths of the dead. Their salvation was possible only when the true king, the heir of Isildur, came and called upon them to fulfill their oath. And now, thousands of years later, the heir of Isildur had stepped upon these accursed lands. But he did not know who he was. He saw himself only as an ordinary ranger, strider. And this ignorance, this identitylessness, appeared before the eyes of the ghostly king who stood before him, that glorious and terrible being, as the greatest obstacle, the most impassable wall. The ghostly king awaited the solution to his 1,000-year curse, the coming of the heir of Isildur. But before him stood an ordinary mortal who saw himself as a nothing, rejected his identity, and carried no royal authority. The ghostly king asked Aragorn with a cold and chilling voice, "Who are you? I do not know you. You are not my king. You are only an ordinary mortal." These words were the most painful and most terrible confrontation of Aragorn's identitylessness. Had he been a king, he could have commanded these dead, led them into battle. But he was only a mortal, and the dead did not know him. In the face of the ghostly king's words, Aragorn, with that deep pain and helplessness within him, also experienced a reckoning within himself. Once again, he questioned who he was. "Who am I, truly?" he thought. "Am I a king, or a nothing? Am I a hope, or a wanderer? And if I am not that king these dead await, then what am I seeking on this accursed road?" These questions echoed in Aragorn's mind more intensely than ever before. On these accursed lands, he was experiencing the deepest and most painful confrontation of that identitylessness and resentment within him. But even in this dark and hopeless moment, Aragorn did not surrender. He answered the ghostly king with that deep pain and helplessness within him, "I am Strider, an ordinary ranger. But I am here to save this world from the darkness. If you fight by my side, perhaps you will be freed from your curse." These words were not the glorious and authoritative challenge of a king, but the last and hopeless cry of a desperate and nameless ranger. But within this cry there was devotion, courage, and the determination to sacrifice everything to save Middle-earth. The ghostly king looked at these words with doubt and anger. "You cannot break our curse," he said, his voice cold and merciless. "This curse can only be broken by the heir of Isildur. And you are not the heir of Isildur. You are only an ordinary mortal. You cannot command these restless spirits of these accursed lands, cannot lead them into battle, and cannot break their curse. Go and leave us alone." And so, the dead refused to serve Aragorn. This refusal was the most devastating and most decisive consequence of Aragorn's identitylessness and his disbelief in himself. He had lost, because of his own identitylessness, the most powerful and most terrible war force of Middle-earth, that accursed army that could have been the most decisive against the darkness. Had he known his true identity, that he was the heir of Isildur, he could have commanded these dead, led them into battle, and fundamentally changed the fate of Middle-earth. But he did not know who he was, and this ignorance, at the most critical moment, would cost him and Middle-earth dearly. This refusal also revealed one of the deepest and most tragic ironies of the story. Because Aragorn rejected his identity, saw himself as a nothing, did not know he was the heir of Isildur, he lost the most powerful war force. On these accursed lands, he experienced in the most painful and sharpest way how his identitylessness, his disbelief in himself, and his rejection of his fate affected not only his own life, but also the fate of Middle-earth. And this was perhaps the strongest proof of one of the most important lessons of the story, that identity and faith in oneself are not only a personal matter, but also a decisive factor determining a person's place and power in the world. Aragorn answered the ghostly king with that deep pain and helplessness within him, I am Strider, an ordinary ranger. But I am here to save this world from the darkness. If you fight by my side, perhaps you will be freed from your curse. The ghostly king looked at these words with doubt and anger. You cannot break our curse, he said. This curse can only be broken by the heir of Isildur. And so, the dead refused to serve Aragorn. This fundamentally changed the course of the entire war. In the original story, Aragorn, crying out that he was the heir of Isildur, had commanded the dead, led them into the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, and saved Gondor with an overwhelming victory. But in this universe, Aragorn did not possess this power. Without the help of the army of the dead, he had to defend Gondor only with the power of living men, only with mortals fighting with their own will. Aragorn emerged from the paths of the dead with helplessness and disappointment. In his hand was only a small, reluctant, and untrained army composed of the harbor guards and living men he had been able to gather from the south. This army was no different from a suicide mission against Sauron's vast and terrible armies. But Aragorn knew he had no other choice. Gondor was about to be destroyed, and he had to do what he could. And it is toward the most tragic and most glorious battle of the story, toward that great and bloody battle on the Pelennor Fields, that we now advance. In this battle, Aragorn would fight not as a king, but only as a desperate and nameless ranger. And the outcome of this battle would decide not only the fate of Gondor, but the entire future of Middle-earth. The Pelennor Fields were a wide, fertile plain stretching before the white and glorious walls of Minas Tirith. This was one of the richest and most sacred lands of Gondor. But now, this fertile plain had become a terrible battlefield. Sauron's vast armies were pouring toward Minas Tirith from the south and the east. Tens of thousands of orcs, Haradrim soldiers, and terrible war machines had descended upon the plain like a black cloud. The walls of Minas Tirith had been groaning for days under the unceasing stones of catapults and the fire of flaming artillery. Within the city, the steward Denethor, because of the severe wounding of his son Faramir and that dark power penetrating his mind from Sauron, was about to lose his reason and his hope. Gondor's defenders, in helplessness and weariness, were trying to show a last resistance upon the walls. The city was falling a little more with every passing hour. Denethor was a proud and powerful man, descended from the line of the stewards of Gondor, who had ruled this glorious city for many years in the name of a king. He felt deep devotion to the kingdom and his lineage. But within him, at the same time, there was great pride, insecurity, and a deep desire for power. Because Denethor was not a king, because he was a steward, he always carried within him a deficiency, an inferiority complex. He did not want the royal line to rise again, he wanted to preserve his own power and authority. Denethor, using Sauron's Palantir, that seeing stone, had come into contact with Sauron's mind and power. But in this contact, Sauron had filled Denethor's mind with the greatest and darkest aspects of his power, slowly driving him toward despair and madness. Denethor had seen the vast power and invincibility of Sauron's armies and had begun to believe that Gondor could not be saved. He was losing that hope and will within him more and more. Denethor's madness and despair deepened even further with the severe wounding of his son Faramir. Faramir had been severely wounded by the Witch King, the leader of the Nazgul, and had come to the brink of death. When Denethor saw his son in this state, the last spark of hope within him also went out. Thinking that Faramir would die and that Gondor would fall, he went completely mad. He decided to burn himself along with his son, to bury everything in darkness along with himself. This was one of the most tragic and most dark moments of the story. Denethor had been defeated not only as the leader of Gondor, but also as a father. Rather than accept his son's death, he chose to die with him, to burn himself along with him. This mad and terrible decision brought deep demoralization to Gondor's defenders. The leader of the city, in despair, was surrendering himself and his future to the darkness. But in the very midst of this dark moment, Gandalf entered the city and prevented Denethor's mad plan. Gandalf, that wise and powerful being, stopped Denethor from burning himself and his son. He rescued Faramir from the fire and tried to remind Denethor that, in the midst of despair and darkness, there was still hope and goodness. But Denethor was entirely sunk in his madness and despair. He did not want to hear Gandalf's words, thinking he had no choice but to accept his own dark fate. Denethor, in the end, succumbed to his own dark fate. By burning himself, he destroyed along with himself that pride, that fear, and that despair within him. His tragic death created a void in the leadership of Gondor. And who was now to fill this void, to raise Gondor up and lead it in this dark and hopeless time? This question was the most critical question of the story. Because was the defender of Gondor, that brave and nameless ranger fighting the enemy, ready to take up this leadership? And it is in the midst of this dark and hopeless moment that Aragorn, still not fully accepting his identity, but resolved to show the courage and devotion within him, advanced as a ranger toward the center of this battle. He had returned from the paths of the dead, and without the help of those accursed shadows that followed him, ready to fight only with his own will, only with the power of living men. And now, he was advancing toward perhaps the most critical moment of this great battle, this dark and hopeless battle, toward facing the Witch King. And then, from the north, the great cavalry army of Rohan came. Theoden, king of Rohan, with a young and brave but hopeless cry, drove his thousands of cavalry upon the Pelennor fields. "Death!" cried Theoden, his sword gleaming in the sun. "Ride, seek death!" And the Rohirrim, with their glorious and terrible charge, struck the flanks of Sauron's armies. This was the most hopeful and most heroic moment of the battle. But this hope was short-lived. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields was one of the greatest, bloodiest, and most terrible battles Middle-earth had ever seen. Sauron's vast and countless armies clashed with the brave but insufficient forces of Gondor and Rohan, in a terrible battle lasting days, upon the wide and fertile plain of the Pelennor Fields. This battle was not only a military conflict, but also that ancient and eternal war between good and evil, hope and despair, humanity's last resistance against darkness and darkness's effort to crush humanity. At the beginning of the battle, Rohan's glorious cavalry charge struck a terrible blow upon the flanks of Sauron's armies. The Rohirrim, those brave and indomitable cavalry, on their horses, swinging their swords, broke through the ranks of Sauron's armies and inflicted great losses upon them. This was the most hopeful and most heroic moment of the battle. But Sauron's armies were vast in number and inexhaustible. For every Rohirrim who fell, 10 orcs, 20 orcs came in his place. And the battle was increasingly turning into a hopeless and bloody massacre. In the midst of this battle, Aragorn, with a small army composed only of the harbor guards he had been able to gather and the living men of the south, plunged into the very center of the battle. This army was small in number and untrained, but under Aragorn's hopeless and brave leadership, it fought unexpectedly well. Aragorn was a figure who inspired people, who kept them on their feet even in the midst of death and despair. He was not a king, but he was a leader who made people fight, who gave them hope, and who kept them standing against the darkness. The battle lasted for days. The Pelennor fields filled with thousands of corpses. Rohan's bravest cavalry, Gondor's noblest knights, and Sauron's countless orcs gave their lives upon these muddy and bloody lands. Every hour, every minute witnessed the death of dozens of men. In the midst of the battle, Theoden, king of Rohan, fell to the ground with a terrible wound and died. This was a deep loss for Rohan, for humanity, and for this entire war. Theoden, the noble and strong king of Rohan, had fought to his last breath, protected his people, and with an honorable death, on the Pelennor fields, had mingled with the earth among the heroes. Theoden's death was one of the most tragic and most decisive moments of the battle. Rohan's morale was deeply shaken by this loss. But just at that moment, Theoden's niece Eowyn, that disguised princess, prepared to face the most terrible and most dangerous enemy of the battle, the Witch King, to avenge her uncle's death and to save Rohan's honor. This was the bravest, most hopeless, and most decisive moment of the battle. Because the Witch King was the most terrible and most powerful leader of Sauron's armies, and his downfall might, perhaps, change the course of the battle. Eowyn, without her brother Yma's permission, had joined the brave cavalry of Rohan and entered the battle. As a woman, she had rebelled against the taking of her right to fight and win honor, and disguising as a man, had thrown herself onto the battlefield to protect her uncle Theoden and Rohan's honor. And now, when she saw her uncle's death, that sorrow and anger, that courage and determination within her had reached its peak. She, the White Lady of Rohan, was ready to stand before the most terrible enemy of the battle. And when the Witch King descended beside Theoden's corpse, Eowyn, revealing her disguise, stepped before him. This was one of the bravest and most unforgettable moments of the story. A woman, the White Lady of Rohan, was ready to show her courage and honor before the most terrible and most powerful enemy. And this moment, as the brightest and most heroic spark of the battle, of hope, and of humanity, would shine in the dark and bloody atmosphere of the Pelennor fields. Aragorn unfurled no noble royal banner. In his hand was not Anduril, that glorious king sword reforged, he had only an ordinary steel sword forged from the battered iron of Eriador. He could not cry out to the people, "I am your king, follow me," because he was not a king. But he swung his sword, mowed down enemies, and cried to the men beside him, "If you want to live, fight." And the people followed this nameless, resentful but incredibly brave ranger. This was a raw, merciless, and bloody battle. The Pelennor fields filled with thousands of corpses. Rohan's bravest cavalry, Gondor's noblest knights, and Sauron's countless orcs gave their lives upon these muddy and bloody lands. In the midst of the battle, Theoden, king of Rohan, fell to the ground with a terrible wound and died. And his death deeply shook Rohan's morale. But the most terrible and most decisive moment of the battle was the appearance of the king of the Nazgul, the Witch King of Angmar. This terrible and undying being, riding a great winged creature, flew over the Pelennor fields, spreading death. The Witch King destroyed everything before him, every living creature, spreading fear and death. He seemed like an undying power, swords and arrows could not harm him. And then, the Witch King descended beside the fallen corpse of Theoden. A young and brave Rohan warrior, in a green cloak, stepped before the Witch King to protect Theoden. This warrior was in fact Theoden's niece, the disguised Princess Eowyn. The Witch King cried out in anger to this mortal who stood before him, "No living man can defeat me." But Eowyn, throwing off her cloak, cried out that ancient prophecy, "I am no living man. I am a woman. And you shall face me." This moment was that glorious and unforgettable moment when Eowyn, with all her strength and all her honor, broke free from that cage, those social and traditional walls, in which she had been imprisoned all her life. As a woman, she had rebelled all her life against the taking of her right to fight and win honor. And now, in the most terrible and most decisive moment of the battle, she was proving her power, her courage, and her identity to the whole world, before the most terrible enemy. She was no longer a princess, she was a warrior. She was no longer an imprisoned woman, she was a free spirit. She had taken her own fate into her own hands. Eowyn, before the Witch King, with the sword in her hand, with all her courage and all her determination, stood. The Witch King looked at this mortal who stood before him with anger and contempt. "No living man can defeat me," cried the Witch King, his voice dark and chilling. But Eowyn answered this threat, this contempt, with the courage and anger within her. She stood before the Witch King, throwing off her cloak, revealing her disguise, and crying out her identity. This was that unforgettable moment when a woman, before the most terrible and most powerful enemy, cried out her own identity and power. And then, that glorious and terrible duel began. Eowyn and the Witch King fought each other in the dark and bloody atmosphere of the Pelennor fields. The Witch King, like an undying power, with a dark power that rendered swords and arrows ineffective, attacked Eowyn. He spread fear and death, trying to crush and destroy Eowyn. But Eowyn did not succumb to fear, did not waver, and did not give up. With the courage and determination within her, she resisted the Witch King's attacks, fought him, and challenged his power. This duel was not only a physical battle, but also a war of will and identity. The Witch King represented the power of immortality and darkness. Eowyn, however, represented the power of mortality, humanity, courage, and freedom. And in this duel, Eowyn, despite all difficulties and all darkness, did not waver. She took severe wounds against the Witch King's attacks, but did not give up. And in the end, with the help of her friend Merry, she struck a deadly blow upon the Witch King, destroying that undying and terrible being. The downfall of the Witch King was the most decisive and turning point of the battle. The most terrible and most powerful leader of Sauron's armies had been destroyed. This was a victory that gave hope and courage against the darkness, that changed the course of the battle. But this victory came at a heavy price for Eowyn. In the duel with the Witch King, she had been severely wounded and had come to the brink of death. Eowyn, after this glorious and terrible victory, lay upon the Pelennor fields, in her own blood. But Eowyn's victory was not only a physical victory. It was, at the same time, a victory of identity and freedom. As a woman, Eowyn had broken free with all her strength from that cage, those social walls, in which she had been imprisoned all her life, and had proven her identity and power to the whole world. She was no longer a princess, she was a warrior. She was no longer an imprisoned woman, she was a free spirit. She had taken her own fate into her own hands and won her own honor and victory. And this was, perhaps, Eowyn's greatest and most lasting victory of this entire war. Because without the help of the army of the dead, the Battle of the Pelennor Fields did not end with an overwhelming and clean victory as in the original story. The battle ended with a hopeless struggle lasting hours, a terrible massacre, and incredible losses. Gondor's noblest knights and Rohan's bravest cavalry were buried that day in the muddy lands of the Pelennor. The city stood, but almost all of its defenders had been destroyed. Victory had been won, yes. But the smell of this victory was only of death, blood, and ash. Minas Tirith had been saved, but had been turned into a ruin. And most importantly, when the people of Gondor looked at this dirty, weary, and nameless ranger who had saved them, at Aragorn, they saw not a king, but only a mad and desperate warrior torn from the heart of the wilderness. He had saved them, but they did not know who he was, or which throne awaited him. This victory on the Pelennor Fields did not bring Middle-earth the great hope and leadership that had been awaited. The throne was still empty. Humanity still sought a king who would rule them, give them confidence, and give them hope. And Aragorn could not be this king. Because he still saw himself as a nothing, could not accept his identity and his fate. The defenders of Gondor offered the throne and the crown to this mysterious ranger who had saved them. "You saved us," they said. "You must be our king." But Aragorn refused this offer with deep pain. "I am not a king," he said, his voice broken and weary. "I am only a ranger deceived by his past. This throne is not mine. This throne belongs to the line of Isildur. And I did not know that I came from that line was given to me as a lie." And now, we advance toward the true and most decisive stage of the war, the Black Gate. For Frodo and Sam to be able to go to Mount Doom, to destroy the ring, Sauron's eye had to be drawn to the Black Gate and all the remaining army massed there. This was a last and hopeless plan of sacrifice. Aragorn had to lead this plan. But this time, not as a king, but only as a desperate ranger, he would march toward death. The Black Gate was that vast, terrible, and accursed gate on the northern border of Mordor. It was also known as the Moran Non. Here, Sauron's main forces, all his armies, were massed before this gate. Aragorn brought that small, battered, and hopeless army at his command before this vast and terrible enemy army. This was a march to certain death, to suicide. But Aragorn knew he had no other choice. He had to make this sacrifice to buy time for Frodo and Sam. This march to the Black Gate was one of the darkest and most hopeless moments of Aragorn's life. With a small army at his side, he was advancing against a terrible and vast enemy. He knew that this march would most likely be his last. But he was still ready to undertake this last journey, with that deep courage and devotion within him. Because he believed in Frodo and Sam, in the task of destroying the ring, in this dark and hopeless task. On this march, Aragorn still had not fully accepted his identity and his fate. But he had begun to understand one thing, that identity lies not in titles and crowns, but in behaviors and choices. He was acting not as a king, but like a king. He was ready to sacrifice his own life for the salvation of Middle-earth and its people. This was a manifestation of that wisdom, that deep truth Gandalf had told him, true nobility lies within the heart. Aragorn stood before the Black Gate, before that terrible and vast army. Behind him were his weary, wounded but resolute warriors. Before him, Sauron's countless orcs, trolls, and terrible creatures awaited before that black and vast gate. Aragorn made a last attempt to challenge Sauron's mind, through that seeing stone, the Palantir. Like a king, he sent a challenge to Sauron. But Sauron contemptuously refused this challenge. Sauron saw into Aragorn's mind and felt that darkness, that identitylessness within him. He perceived this challenge as the desperate cry of a powerless ranger, a nothing. And then, that inevitable and terrible battle began. Sauron's armies poured toward that small and hopeless army before the Black Gate. This was the beginning of a certain massacre, a bloody and merciless slaughter. Aragorn and his warriors showed a helpless and hopeless resistance against the vast and overwhelming enemy army. Fighting to the death, they tried to buy time for Frodo and Sam. Every minute was, for them, a minute won for hope. But they were not aware of one thing in this dark and hopeless battle. In the east, in the heart of Mordor, Frodo and Sam were continuing their own difficult and dangerous journey. They were crawling toward Mount Doom in this accursed land covered in ash, lava, and darkness. And their journey was the true purpose of this great and hopeless war, of all these sacrifices and losses. This battle at the Black Gate was only a deception, a tactic to buy time. The true war, the true struggle, was taking place in the heart of Mordor, in the souls of those two small hobbits. And it is at this point that the focus of the narrative shifts, from this hopeless war in the west, to that small and quiet struggle in the east, to Frodo and Sam's journey to Mount Doom. Because the fate of Middle-earth, in truth, had been laid not upon those glorious armies and heroes, but upon the shoulders of those two small, fragile, and helpless hobbits. And their journey was the most important, deepest, and most hopeless part of this great epic. Before the Black Gate, Aragorn raised that ordinary steel sword in his hand into the air and cried out one last challenge. But this challenge was not the glorious and arrogant challenge of a king, but the last cry of a desperate and nameless ranger. The great eye of Sauron looked at this insignificant, nameless, and resentful ranger. And Sauron tried to penetrate this ranger's mind. This encounter, before the Black Gate, in the dark and crushing atmosphere of Mordor, was one of the most critical and most decisive moments of the story. For thousands of years, Sauron had built his power and control upon pride and ambition. He could manipulate, corrupt, and enslave an enemy by taking advantage of his pride and ambition. And he thought that an heir of the line of Isildur, a prideful king who wanted to reclaim his throne, would, because of this pride and ambition, become his rival and want to use the ring for his own power. Sauron promised Aragorn the throne, the power, Arwen, and all the treasures of the world. He tried to penetrate Aragorn's mind, to awaken his pride and ambition, to turn him into his instrument. "Take your throne," whispered Sauron's voice, in Aragorn's mind, in a dark and seductive tone. "Seize the power. Win Arwen. Let all the treasures of the world be yours. You are worthy of being a king. Only join me, accept my power, rise with me." But Aragorn could not answer these promises, these whispers, with anything but that deep pain and helplessness within him. Because Aragorn had seen himself as a nothing, had rejected the throne, had not wanted power. He had grown up believing he was already a nothing. That throne, that power, that Arwen, and those treasures that Sauron promised him awakened no pride and ambition in Aragorn's mind. Because Aragorn did not see himself as worthy of these things. He believed he did not deserve the throne, could not use the power, could not win Arwen, and could not bear these treasures. Sauron found in his mind no royal pride to dominate him, no desire for power, no hunger for the throne. This was the most unexpected and most astonishing situation in Sauron's career. For thousands of years, he had corrupted people by manipulating their pride and ambition. But before him stood a man who carried no pride or ambition, saw himself as a nothing, rejected the throne and the power. Sauron found in this man's mind no hook with which to establish his power and control. In the face of this situation, for the first time, he felt genuine astonishment and an instinctive fear. This man, thought Sauron, is not a man as I understand. He does not want power. He does not want the throne. He carries no pride or ambition. What does he want? Why is he here? Sauron began to understand that this man before him was not a prideful human prince who wanted to use the ring for his own power, but on the contrary, an ordinary mortal who saw himself as nothing, ready to give his life for the destruction of the ring. This realization deeply shook Sauron's mind. In his world, which had been built upon power and pride for thousands of years, he had never encountered a man who carried no pride or ambition, did not want power, and saw himself as a nothing. This man was a being that Sauron could not understand, could not control, and could not manipulate. And this was, for Sauron, the most frightening and most uncertain situation. Aragorn did not know that his identity, which he saw as a nothing, unknowingly formed the strongest protective shield against Sauron's greatest weapon. He had carried his identitylessness all his life as a curse, a burden, a pain. But now, before the Black Gate, before the great eye of Sauron, this identitylessness, this seeing of himself as a nothing, was becoming a hidden armor protecting him against Sauron's dark power. Because he carried no pride or ambition, Sauron had no hook with which to catch him. And this was, perhaps, one of the deepest and most ironic paradoxes of the story. Aragorn's greatest weakness, his identitylessness, was at the same time his strongest weapon against Sauron. And this realization distracted Sauron's attention and caused his eye to turn toward the true danger within the mountain, toward Frodo and Sam. Instead of expending his power and mind against this man he could not control, who carried no pride or ambition, Sauron began to seek the true threat. And he noticed those small hobbits in the heart of the darkness, perhaps too late, perhaps just in time. But this realization may have been too late. Perhaps it was just in time. Because Frodo and Sam had already reached Mount Doom, that place that would decide fate. Sauron understood that this man before him was not a prideful human prince who wanted to use the ring for his own power, but on the contrary, an ordinary mortal who saw himself as nothing, ready to give his life for the destruction of the ring. This realization distracted Sauron's attention and caused his eye to turn toward the true danger within the mountain, toward Frodo and Sam. But this realization may have been too late. Perhaps it was just in time. Because before the Black Gate, Aragorn and his remaining last army fought a hopeless and terrible battle against Sauron's vast armies. This was not, as in the original story, a battle where the ghost army or another miracle came at the last moment. This was a hopeless slaughter, a terrible massacre. Aragorn's army was being crushed before the wave after wave of Sauron's armies. But Aragorn fought to his last breath. He was not a king, but with the courage of self-sacrifice, he fought more nobly than a king. And just at that moment, that inevitable and miraculous moment came. In the depths of Mount Doom, in the last moment of the ring, Frodo succumbed to that ancient and deadly power and placed the ring upon his own finger. But at that moment, Gollum, that is, Smeagol, intervened in this struggle. Gollum bit off the ring from Frodo's finger and, with victory, with mad joy, fell into the fires of Mount Doom, into that searing lava. And the ring, that ancient and deadly object, together with Gollum, was destroyed forever in the fires of Mount Doom. This moment was the most devastating and most ironic moment of this entire long and dark epic. At the end of all this journey, all these sacrifices, and all these pains, Frodo failed, at the very last moment, in the task of destroying the ring. After a journey of thousands of kilometers, all those dangers, and all those wounds, in that last moment of the ring at the edge of the fires, he succumbed to that ancient and deadly power. He could not throw the ring into the fires, he placed it upon his own finger and claimed, the precious. This was the tragedy of how the greatest sacrifice, the deepest pain, and the most unshakable will could be defeated, at the very last moment. But at that moment came that moment which miraculously transformed this defeat, this tragedy, from the deepest and most unexpected corner of the darkness, into goodness and victory. Gollum, that is, Smeagol, the corrupted and obsessive soul, believed that the ring was his, precious, that it would be his forever. And when he saw the ring upon Frodo's finger, this desire, this obsession, overwhelmed everything within him. He bit off the ring from Frodo's finger and, with victory, with mad joy, fell together with his own, precious, into the fires of Mount Doom, into that searing lava. And the ring, that ancient and deadly object, together with Gollum, was destroyed forever in the fires of Mount Doom. This moment was one of the deepest and most unforgettable moments of the story. Frodo could not destroy the ring, but Gollum's obsession unknowingly completed this task. The weakest and most corrupted soul, the darkest and most obsessive desire, unknowingly, accomplished the greatest sacrifice and the greatest victory. And this showed us that even in the deepest corner of the darkness, goodness and hope could be born in the most unexpected and most tragic ways. Nothing was completely lost, no soul was too dark to never heal, and no fate was too certain to never change. And at that moment, Aragorn, before the Black Gate, covered in blood and nearly dying, saw this miraculous victory. He saw Sauron's power fade, the darkness disperse, and the world brighten. He now understood that his identity, which he saw as a nothing, had unknowingly formed the strongest protective shield against Sauron's greatest weapon. Because he carried no pride or ambition, Sauron had no hook with which to catch him. And this identitylessness, this seeing of himself as a nothing, had perhaps, in the darkest moments, been the strongest and most unexpected shield against Sauron's darkness. Without knowing that he was not a king, Aragorn fought like a king, and thinking he was a nothing, he became that great and unforgettable hero who saved the world. And it is for this reason that this story is not the story of a king, but the story of a nothing. Because this story shows us that the greatest power lies not in the most glorious thrones and the most prideful kings, but in the most humble souls, the most loyal hearts, and the purest loves. Aragorn, without knowing his identity, by rejecting his fate, by seeing himself as a nothing, but with that courage, that devotion, and that goodness within him, saved Middle-earth. And Sam, as an ordinary gardener, with love and loyalty, carried his master into the heart of darkness. And Frodo, though defeated at the very last moment, with all his sacrifice, all his burden, all his pain, opened the way for the destruction of the ring. And Gollum, as the most corrupted soul, with his obsession, unknowingly, accomplished the greatest victory. This story is, truly, the story of a nothing, but this story of a nothing is far greater, far deeper, and far more unforgettable than the stories of kings. This moment was the deepest, most tragic, and most ironic moment of this entire long and dark epic. The ring was destroyed in the hands of the one who desired it most, worshipped it most, and longed for it most. Gollum had worshipped the ring for hundreds of years, sacrificed everything for it, seen it as his precious. And in the end, he fell, together with this precious thing, into the fires of Mount Doom. His desire, his obsession, became his end. This was the darkest and most ironic victory of obsession, desire, and attachment. Gollum's fate, as one of the most thought-provoking and most tragic figures of the narrative, showed us that our desires, our obsessions, and our attachments could both exalt and destroy us. Because of his obsession with the ring, Gollum was both destroyed and, ironically, became the instrument of Middle-earth's salvation. This dual fate of his formed one of the deepest philosophical layers of the story. Even in the deepest corner of the darkness, sometimes, unknowingly, one could become an instrument for goodness and hope. When the fires of Mount Doom swallowed the ring, Frodo, weary, wounded, and with his soul torn apart, stood at the edge of that searing lava. In the last moment of the ring, he had succumbed to that ancient and deadly power and had placed it upon his own finger. But Gollum's intervention had miraculously transformed this defeat into victory. Frodo had succumbed to the lure of the ring at the last moment, but this defeat had been unknowingly turned, by Gollum's desire, into salvation. Sam, that faithful and brave gardener, rescued the wounded and exhausted Frodo from the slope of Mount Doom, from those terrible and shaking lava flows and the doom of the collapsing mountain. After this miraculous and incredible victory, they embraced each other, wept, and could not believe that they were alive, that this terrible journey had ended. They, two small hobbits, had completed the most impossible task, that greatest task that changed the fate of Middle-earth. The rescue of Frodo and Sam was carried out with the help of the eagles, those great and noble creatures, Gwaihir and his people. The eagles carried Frodo and Sam, from the collapsing slope of Mount Doom, from the ashes and darkness of Mordor, to a safe place, to the green and spacious lands of Ithilien. There, Frodo and Sam were reunited with the other hobbits, Merry and Pippin, and enjoyed the end of this great and terrible epic, the peace and the victory. The ring had been destroyed. Sauron's power, in that moment, completely faded. Barad-dûr, that terrible and vast tower, collapsed with a great noise. The Nazgul, together with their winged creatures, shattered in the air and fell to the ground. Sauron's armies, having lost their leader, panicked, scattered, and fled. Middle-earth had finally and forever been freed from that ancient and deadly darkness, from Sauron's shadow. Before the Black Gate, Aragorn, covered in blood and nearly dying, saw this miraculous victory. He saw Sauron's armies scatter, the darkness end, and the world brighten. He planted the broken sword in his hand into the ground, fell to his knees, and took a deep breath. Victory had been won. But the cost of this victory was terrible. Thousands of men had given their lives in this battle. And in this victory, Aragorn found nothing for himself. He was still a nothing. When the war ended, everything fell into silence. Gondor had been saved, Middle-earth was free, but the throne was still empty. Faramir, as steward, took over the rule of Gondor. The people once again offered the crown and the throne to that mysterious ranger who had saved them, to Aragorn. "You saved us twice," they said. "You must be our king. Gondor awaits you." But Aragorn refused this offer, deeply and painfully. Aragorn stood before Faramir and said, "Gondor has no need of a king, Faramir. Gondor needs only living people who till their land and sleep in peace. I am not a king. I never was. All my life I was raised on a lie, lived with an identitylessness, and now this throne reminds me only of that lie and that pain. Let this life, which I began as a ranger, end in the silence of the wilderness." And so, Aragorn rejected the royal inheritance, the throne, and the crown that had been given to him but that he had never claimed. He donned his cloak, took his faithful companions Legolas and Gimli by his side, and quietly, without even looking back, walked out through the gates of Minas Tirith. He ignored the honors, the cheers, and the calls that came after him from the city. Now, not as a king, but as a ranger, he was returning to that silent and lonely road of his own choosing. Aragorn returned northward, to Eriador, to the heart of that old and familiar wilderness. He lived the rest of his life as that old, nameless, and resentful ranger, Strider. He wandered the wild lands, joined the rangers, guarded the borders, and existed quietly, like an invisible shadow. But he was no longer as resentful and identityless as before. Within him there was a quiet wisdom from that great war he had lived through, that sacrifice, and that victory. He had accepted that he was not a king, but he had also learned that he was not a nothing. He was a ranger, and with this identity, with his own choice, he lived in peace. Arwen, in Rivendell, together with her father Elrond, set sail for the immortal lands, for Valinor. In this universe, their glorious wedding never took place. Their love remained in the pages of history unwritten, a silent whisper, a forgotten dream. Arwen had loved Aragorn, but because he saw himself as a nothing, this love was never fully lived. The two of them, with the silent pain of this lost love, went their own ways in separate worlds. But Arwen's perspective formed the saddest and deepest layer of the story of this lost love. Arwen was an immortal elf woman who had lived for thousands of years. At the border of immortality and mortality, of eternity and transience, she had to make one of the most difficult choices. She had loved Aragorn, that man, that mortal, and this love had made her ready to sacrifice her own immortal nature. For Aragorn, she was ready to abandon her immortality, Valinor, her family, and her people. But Aragorn could not accept this sacrifice. He saw himself as a nothing, did not believe in his own worth, and did not believe he deserved Arwen's great sacrifice. When Arwen tried to offer him her love and her sacrifice, Aragorn hesitated to accept this love and this sacrifice, fleeing from this great feeling in the shadow of his own identitylessness and resentment. For Arwen, this was an indescribable devastation, the pain that the man for whom she was ready to sacrifice her own immortality could not accept this sacrifice. As time passed, Arwen witnessed Aragorn seeing himself as nothing, rejecting his own fate and identity. She saw that war, that fear, that longing, and that flight within Aragorn. And she understood that this war was, within Aragorn himself, a struggle far deeper than titles and crowns. With the pain of this lost love, Arwen carried a deep loneliness and sorrow within herself as well. She had lost a love, but the cause of losing this love was not a war, a death, or a betrayal. It was Aragorn's own identitylessness and his disbelief in himself. And in the end, Arwen, together with her father Elrond and the remaining elves, set sail for the immortal lands, for Valinor. From the Grey Havens, toward the setting of the sun, she set out toward the realm of immortality and eternity. But in her heart, the memory of Aragorn, the pain of that lost love, and the sorrow of that fate that never came to pass would be carried forever. Arwen would live in Valinor as an immortal elf, but that loss within her heart, that deficiency, that void of a love never lived, would never leave her. At the threshold of immortality, she would carry forever the pain of loving a mortal man and being unable to be with him, of that lost fate. This was the tragedy of two hearts carrying the same love yet being unable to draw near to one another, sharing the same fate yet parting on different roads. Arwen and Aragorn had loved each other, but Aragorn's disbelief in himself prevented them from living this love, this fate, and this life. And this loss was a symbol not only of two individuals, but of two worlds, the elven world and the human world, being unable to unite and being separated. Middle-earth had lost the common future of elves and men in this lost love, in this fate that never came to pass. But the story did not end here. After this war, Middle-earth was entering a new age, the Fourth Age. The shadow of Sauron had dispersed, but this did not mean that all the world's problems were now solved. The elves, leaving their forests and seas, were setting out toward Valinor, the immortal lands. Their age, that glorious and mystical age lasting thousands of years, was ending. And men, now as the masters, rulers, and future of Middle-earth, were entering this new age, the Fourth Age, with their own strength, their own decisions, and their own responsibilities. In this new age, Gondor, under the wise and compassionate leadership of Faramir, was rebuilt and flourished. Minas Tirith rose from its ruins, its white walls shone again, and its people began to live in peace and prosperity. Rohan, under the strong and brave leadership of Ema, was revived again, and the kingdom of the horses regained its splendor. The Shire, that calm and peaceful realm of the hobbits, greened again, and the hobbits, far from the shadow of war, returned to their old happy and simple lives. But in the shadow of this new age, there was still whispered, as a legend, the memory of a lost king. The people of Gondor never forgot that mysterious ranger who had saved them, that nameless hero. They did not know his name, but they always remembered his sacrifice, his courage, and that will of his that dispersed the darkness. And some elders, some wise ones, always whispered who this ranger truly was, that he was the last king descended from the line of Isildur, but that he had refused to sit upon his throne. This whisper was passed from tongue to tongue, from generation to generation, over the centuries. And over time, this whisper turned into a legend, a tale, a story, the story of the king who did not sit upon his throne in Gondor but saved the world. This story was told to children and grandchildren around fires on dark nights. And this story lived forever, beyond identity, titles, and crowns, as a symbol of true nobility, courage, sacrifice, and that goodness within the heart. Aragorn, in his old age, in the midst of the wilderness, took his last breath alone beneath a tree. Beside him was neither a palace guard nor a royal banner laid over him. Only leaves, whispered by the wind, were laid over this nameless ranger, this lost king, this silent hero, who had seen himself as a nothing but had saved the world from darkness. And so, the last heir carrying the blood of Isildur, not as a king but as a ranger, quietly and forgotten, mingled with the earth in the heart of the wilderness. But this death, although silent and forgotten, was in truth the most natural, most sincere, and most peaceful moment of Aragorn's life. All his life, he had sought his identity, questioned his fate, and fled from titles. He had refused to be a king, accepted being a nothing, but in truth, beyond both, he had found his own way. In the end, as a soul at peace with himself, reconciled with his own identity and his own fate, in the peace of the wilderness, in the embrace of nature, he took his last breath in peace. Aragorn's death was the death of not a king, but a man. But this man, throughout his life, had changed the world, dispersed the darkness, and saved Middle-earth. Without bearing a title, without wearing a crown, without sitting upon his throne, he had become a hero. He had seen himself as a nothing, but in truth, had become everything. He had rejected his identity, but fulfilled his fate. And this was, perhaps, the deepest and most unforgettable truth of Aragorn's story. Without knowing that he was not a king, he lived like a king, and thinking he was a nothing, he became that great and unforgettable hero who saved the world. When Aragorn died, beside him there was neither a palace guard nor a royal banner laid over him. But he, in truth, possessed that one thing he had wanted all his life, peace. He had finally been freed from seeking his identity, questioning his fate, and fleeing from titles. He had made peace with himself, reconciled with his own identity and his own fate. And with this peace, this harmony, in the heart of the wilderness, in the embrace of nature, quietly and peacefully, he mingled with the earth. And so, the last heir carrying the blood of Isildur, not as a king but as a ranger, not as a nothing but as a hero, quietly and forgotten, but in truth, in the shadow of that great and unforgettable sacrifice that saved the world, mingled with the earth in the heart of the wilderness. His story was not the story of a king, but the story of a nothing. But this story of a nothing was far greater, far deeper, and far more unforgettable than the stories of kings. Because this story forever reminded us that identity, nobility, and heroism lie not in titles and crowns, but in choices, sacrifices, and that goodness, that courage, and that hope within the heart. But this story was not a forgotten story. Because Middle-earth was free thanks to the sacrifice of this nameless ranger. And some wise elves, some old men, always whispered who that man who had saved them truly was, that he was the last king descended from the line of Isildur, but that fate had led him down a different road, to a different identity. And this whisper, over the centuries, circulated from tongue to tongue as a legend, a tale, a story, the story of the king who did not sit upon his throne in Gondor but saved the world. Now, let us look at the lessons to be drawn from this story, at the meaning of this tragedy and this victory. Is identity only a name told to us? Or is it determined by that silent faith we carry in our hearts, that inner worth, and our actions? Aragorn lived without knowing he was a king and died as a ranger. Perhaps Middle-earth never saw his glorious reign. But without sheltering behind a false title, without accepting an identity not given to him, he fought the greatest battle of remaining only a man, of finding his own worth and purpose without needing titles. This story also shows how devastating consequences well-intentioned lies, hidden truths, and decisions thought to be protective can lead to. Elrond and Gilraen did not tell Aragorn the truth to protect him. But this protection caused him to spend his life in an identitylessness and resentment, to lose his love with Arwen, and to become alienated from his own fate. Sometimes, knowing the truth, even when most painful, is worth more than a protective lie. Because the truth gives a person the freedom to make his own choice, to find his own identity, and to shape his own fate. But this story also shows that the intention of being protective, however great and well-meaning, sometimes causes the greatest harm. Elrond and Gilraen wanted to protect Aragorn from the darkness, the curse, and the pride. They hid the truth from him to protect the child they loved from the repetition of the ancient mistake of his ancestor Isildur. But this hiding, this protection, caused Aragorn's life to pass in the shadow of identitylessness, insecurity, and resentment. And this protection was, perhaps, the most tragic and most destructive form of love, for the sake of protecting those they loved from the darkness, condemning them to an even deeper darkness, the darkness of identitylessness. This story also shows that fate and identity lie not only in the titles and crowns given to us, but also in the choices we make, the values we carry, and the road we walk. Aragorn lived without knowing he was not a king, but he acted like a king. He did not wear a royal crown, but he became one of the noblest and bravest leaders of humanity. He was not called a king, but he became the symbol of the salvation of Middle-earth. And this is, perhaps, the deepest truth of identity. Identity is not something given to us, but something we build. Identity is not the place we are born, but the road we walk. Identity is not what is told to us, but what we are. And perhaps the most important lesson of this story is that a person's worth is determined not by his birth, title, or fate, but by his courage, sacrifice, and resolve to do what is right. Aragorn did not know he was a king, did not wear a crown, did not sit upon his throne. But he was the man who saved Middle-earth from the darkness, who sacrificed himself, who freed the world. The fate of Middle-earth was laid upon the shoulders not of the greatest armies and the strongest kings, but of two small hobbits, Frodo and Sam, those small and faithful souls. Against vast and terrible enemies, with ordinary swords and fragile bodies, they fought a hopeless but brave struggle. And their loyalty, love, and courage accomplished what all the great armies and powerful kings could not. This reminds us that greatness and heroism lie not in power and glory, but in the heart and in love. And this story also shows that even in the darkest moments, hope and goodness can, unknowingly, be born from the most unexpected places. Gollum, a corrupted and obsessive soul, in the end, unknowingly, saved Middle-earth by destroying the ring. His obsession and desire became his end, but also the instrument of Middle-earth's salvation. This shows us that even in the deepest corner of the darkness, goodness and hope can be born in the most unexpected and most tragic ways. And perhaps nothing is completely lost, no soul is too dark to never heal, and no fate is too certain to never change. This story holds within it all these lessons, all these tragedies and victories, all these losses and salvations. It is not the story of a king, but the story of a nothing. It is not the story of a title, but the story of a heart. It is not the story of a throne, but the story of a journey. And this journey forever reminds us that identity, nobility, and heroism lie not in titles and crowns, but in choices, sacrifices, and that goodness, that courage, and that hope within the heart. And this was the story of Aragorn, the man who carried the blood of Isildur but never learned to be a king. This was the story of the ranger who saw himself as nothing but saved the world. This was the story of a lost fate, a hidden identity, and despite all of this, a heart that did what was right. And this story reminds us that our true identity lies not in the titles given to us, but in the choices we make and the values we carry. If you felt that this story touched you, if the tragedy and victory of this lost king affected you, share your thoughts and comments with us. In your opinion, was Elrond right to keep this secret? If Aragorn had known he was a king, would Middle-earth have been a brighter place, or would the same pride and catastrophe have been reborn? Let us discover the answer to these and similar questions together in the comments. And as we come to the end of this dark and thought-provoking journey of Middle-earth, let us remember once again, kings are remembered by their crowns, but worlds are saved by the sacrifice of nameless heroes. Although the lost heir of Isildur is remembered not as a king but as a ranger, his name will be whispered forever as a symbol of the freedom of Middle-earth. And perhaps the greatest nobility lies not upon the most glorious throne, but in the courage to do what is right even in the darkest moments. This is the story of the man who carried the blood of Isildur but never learned to be a king, of the ranger who saw himself as nothing but saved the world, of a lost fate and, despite it all, a heart that did what was right. His name was never recorded with any crown or banner. But in the freedom of Middle-earth, in the dispersal of the darkness, and in the rebirth of hope, the trace of his silent sacrifice will live forever. And it is for this reason that the greatest stories are written, more often than not upon the greatest thrones, but in the quietest and most forgotten corners, in the most humble and most courageous hearts.